people whose idleness is enforced because of a contribution to a public health emergency. And what is so hard to understand is that the system for doing that is staring the government in the face. It already exists. It is called Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. It is a system for taking money out of wage packets every month and giving it to the government, and now it should be put into reverse and put money into the pockets of those employees.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. He's absolutely right to express the deep frustration of people in that sector, and I'm sure across the House his words resonate. We have put in resources for 2,000 people to be able to take calls for bespoke solutions from HMRC to deal with some of those particular issues. He's right to say there is also an issue in terms of insurance and access to insurance. I've certainly, I met with, I was on a conference call with the insurance industry to clarify that those where that insurance has taken place has been taken out, that will now be effective. But he's perfectly right to say that there is more work that needs to be done, and I'd be very clear that more will be forthcoming imminently.
John Morrison.
I thank the Minister for the measures that he's already taken to help the self-employed, but in my constituency in Beaconsfield we have the highest number of self-employed in the country. And would the Minister be able to elaborate on what tax incentives or tax advice or support can be given to the self-employed during this time, particularly over April and the end of the financial year?
Minister.
Well, as I said to the honourable gentleman, they do have access to an HMRC support line that is properly manned and up and running, and that should give them bespoke support for their circumstances. And there are the package of other measures that I've referred to and the Chancellor announced a few days ago.
Caroline Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Charities like Faith in Families in my constituency in Swansea are really nervous. They're not going to be able to pay their wages. Without the staff, they can't deliver the projects which they're applying for funding for, which are food and childcare facilities in very deprived areas. It's necessary now. It will become essential in the future. What can the government do to help these charities?
The honourable lady is absolutely right with respect to the role that charities play across our communities, binding communities together, working closely with local authorities. And my colleague in the Department for Local Government is working on these matters, and we will bring further announcements shortly.
Tobias.
Mr. Speaker, can I echo the calls for urgent support for British tourism, something I know he'll be familiar with in his own constituency. In the Bournemouth area, tourism is worth over £1 billion and directly employs 17,000 people. I've received a letter from David Bailey, who's chair of the Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Destination Management Board, who talks about layoffs happening right now as we speak, affecting the future of businesses. He says, rather than handing out benefit claims, would it not be better for the government to actually provide those salaries immediately? That would mean the industry can retain the skills that would be needed to spearhead the economic recovery and reduce the number of businesses that cease to trade. Will the government consider this?
My right honourable friend makes some very reasonable points about the tourism sector just down the road from me in Salisbury, and the issue of what we do to support sectors that are most affected by directly and so immediately by the action that we've had to take will be at the top of our minds as we examine what employment support to put in place.
Clive Efford.
What is hard to understand is how, after 6.5 weeks, when we knew we might reach this stage, that the government has got no idea what it's going to do to pay the wages of those people who are being laid off. There's a whole tranche of people who are going to be laid off now. There will be more industries that will lay people off next week and the week after. If the government doesn't act now, it won't be able to retrieve the situation. How have we got to this point where the government hasn't got a clue?
Well, I accept the frustration of the honourable gentleman, but I have to say to characterise the government's situation as not having a clue, I think does misrepresent it considerably. There are a large number of issues that we need to examine, that we are doing so at pace. and we will be making further announcements to address the issues that have been raised in this House today. We have sequentially done more by the day, reflecting the evolving nature of this crisis and the steps that we had to take based on health and scientific advice. I understand the honourable gentleman is not happy with the government's announcements so far, but there will be more that will be coming.
Blackman.
Pubs, clubs, restaurants and other retail outlets will be considering this weekend whether to close on an almost permanent basis. The people employed in those places will have an uncertain future. Now, most of them are relatively young, mobile and able to offer help and assistance to the weak and vulnerable. So could we not have a position whereby loans are guaranteed to those outlets on the condition that people are continued to be paid, and they then become a volunteer force to help the weak and vulnerable at this time of crisis?
As ever, my honourable friend makes a sensible suggestion. I will look very carefully at that.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do wish government ministers would stop using hyperbole like whatever it takes when it doesn't follow through sufficiently quickly. So will the government extend SSP to support all workers and pay it at the rate of the real living wage straight away?
The government will do whatever it takes, but we also want to make sure that when we do it, it will be effective. He makes a specific point there about statutory sick pay, and the government will be bringing forward a package of measures in due course.
Many of the just about managing aren't managing, and in the next few days there'll be many more. The last thing we need at this time is an over-engineered new system. As a humble backbencher, I have heard many good ideas in the chamber this morning, in particular from right honourable members from Chingford, Tunbridge Wells and East Ham. If these three honourable members aren't in number 11 for a meeting later today, I'd be really disappointed. We have the architect of universal credit in the chamber who's given the government the answer to its problem. Please, can we get a move on?
I take the challenge from my honourable friend in the spirit it's intended. There's no sense that the Treasury is trying to over-engineer anything. We are not trying to restrain spending for the sake of restraining spending. What we want to do is bring forward an effective package of measures that meet the needs of the most vulnerable effectively. He makes the reasonable point that a number of colleagues of great seniority have raised significant points of interest, and I will ensure that their contributions are heard at the heart of this process today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dental practices are at very high risk of spreading coronavirus. Yet there was nothing in the financial package on Tuesday for dental practices, which means that they have to stay open, which means there's an increased risk of spreading coronavirus. So will the government give assurances that fixed price dental costs are covered by the government so they can close and only provide urgent care?
The gentleman makes an interesting point. I shall take it back to my colleagues in the Department of Health and Social Care and see what can be done.
Mark Pritchard.
Many of the government schemes have to be delivered through retail banks, which means people and businesses calling call centres already overloaded and going into retail branches where they exist and where perhaps they might restrict hours over the coming days. Most banks and most large private sector companies in this country that rely on some phone contact have resilience and contingency places dotted around the country which have pop-up call centres in times of crisis. Could the government deploy those in making sure desperate, immediate need calls from businesses and individuals are dealt with as quickly as possible?
The honourable gentleman makes a very good point with respect to the resilience required in banks at this time. That's something I discussed with the heads of the banks last night and over the previous 2 days. We need to make sure that the terms of these loans are effective in terms of allowing people to access them swiftly, and we need to make sure that the banks are able to ramp up the accessibility of their specialist advisors, and I'm being given assurances that that is going to be in place.
Make her there.
Mr. Speaker, that so many of my constituents are caught up in this, like with other honourable members, and I have constituents who have no recourse to public funds, so when they're unable to work, they cannot claim benefits. I have many freelancers and people who are self-employed or running small businesses. None of the packages the government has announced help them so far. And the Minister has had to be dragged here for an urgent question and has nothing that he can say that will comfort our constituents. I think we all recognise it's difficult. Could he not even give us a clue about the general direction of thinking in government? Will he raise the local housing allowance? Will they make sure that no recourse to public funds get funded? And will they stop this ridiculous loan system, which will never get paid back? Businesses will go bankrupt before paying it, and they're laying off staff now.
The Honourable Lady raises a number of sensible points. We are looking at many of them, and I want to just reassure her that we will be bringing further announcements very soon. And yes, we are looking at the ideas that have been raised in this. We are looking at other jurisdictions, but we have, in some cases, a very different set of processes and IT systems behind some of these different government department distribution mechanisms. I know that's very technical, but the bottom line is we need to make sure that when we bring something forward, it delivers.
Mr. Speaker, I support strongly the ideas on the universal employment retention package put forward by several right honourable friends here, and I hope the government takes it on board to prevent a health crisis becoming an economic disaster. In addition, briefly, rateable value capped at 51,000 is too low for medium-sized tourist employers like the Seaview Hotel. Secondly, we need clarity in the system because my Chamber of Commerce still does not know how to apply. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, we need a package for the voluntary sector. West White Sports Centre, world-leading UK Sailing Academy are major employers in my patch. So we either need a voluntary sector package or we need a universal employment retention programme. Thank you.
I thank my honourable friend for his points. He raises a number of interesting ideas there. He's absolutely right with respect to the voluntary sector needing support. As I've indicated in earlier responses, there will be a package coming and different departments are working together to make this as effective and as comprehensive as possible. His particular constituency has a number of issues in terms of the hospitality and leisure sector on the Isle of Wight, and I'm very aware of the representations he's been making to government over the previous few days.
Leicesterson.
Bringing people into rent or mortgage arrears or asking businesses to take on debt are not the answers. They're just going to make the crisis worse. And longer, thank you. Every business, every employee, every self-employed person, everyone in the third sector needs to know their living costs will be covered. The government needs to show the urgency that he talks about. They need to show it today. Will the Chancellor come back today, make a statement of how they are going to deliver this?
The honourable gentleman is perfectly right that we need to have a comprehensive package that deals with businesses, the voluntary sector and individual employees of different categories. And we are looking very carefully at the best way to do that in addition to the significant package of measures that we've brought forward. I feel his frustration. I'm going to take all of these points back and make sure that they are addressed.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, the greatest difficulty for the government in this fast deteriorating situation of no one's making is the speed of response. And my worry is that the business interruption loans package will be too clunky for most small and medium-sized businesses, and the cash grants will take too long to get to them before decisions are made about jobs. So will you look closely at the recommendations by our right honourable friend, the member for Tunbridge Wells, because if that is put in place, then some of the recommendations made by the right honourable member for Chingford and Woodford Green on universal credit would not be so important.
I note the point my honourable friend makes with respect to the clunkiness of existing measures, and obviously we are looking at the point raised by my right honourable friend, the member for Tunbridge Wells. He refers to the loans in terms of their accessibility. The nature of the government guarantee to the banks through the British Business Bank is to provide a massive incentive to make sure that these loans are made available to solvent businesses as quickly as possible. But I hear his concerns, and they are reflected in the design and the conversations we're having with the banks now.
Patrick Brady.
Speaker, does the Minister not understand that a universal minimum income guarantee does exactly what it says on the tin? It will provide that minimum level playing field for tenants and their landlords, for business owners and their employees. It provides everyone with a minimum level of assurance so that they can have some certainty in this time of uncertainty.
Yes, I recognise the provisions of a universal minimum income guarantee. We're looking at it, we're looking at a number of options, and we'll bring forward a response as quickly as we can.
Mr. Speaker, I, like many other members of this House, have been fielding calls from businesses for the last 10 days who are sitting on the line, on the wire, wondering whether or not their future is safeguarded. Has the Minister looked at the possibility of doing a VAT rebate to see whether or not those businesses who are desperately trying to hold on to their employees to make sure that they have a future? Can he please look at that, and can he please also ensure that we actually have greater clarification of whether or not pubs are open or closed, because this is causing much greater distress than it needs to?
The honourable gentleman makes a reasonable point about the hospitality sector, and he makes a very credible suggestion with respect to VAT. We are looking across the benefit system and the tax system at the optimisation of interventions to support the most vulnerable and most affected at this time, and to give reassurance to the country as a whole. And we will urgently bring forward measures to address the concerns that he's raised.
Cavan Jones.
Individuals are losing their jobs now. They're in desperate plea now. People like Andrew Brown, a freelance graphic designer in my constituency, who contacted me this morning. Business overnight has folded. He can't apply for any grants because he works from home. So what does he do in that situation? And can I also say to the Minister, he talks about the great package that was announced the other night. Councils have still not got the guidance to get that money out to businesses. So can I urge him to get that out as a matter of urgency? Because I've been told this morning by Durham County Council it will not be available until the weekend. And that's too late.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his points. I accept the need to give urgent advice through DHCLG. My understanding is that that advice will be coming tomorrow. But I understand the frustration that the House feels, and we are all receiving emails from constituents who are in a state of great anxiety. The government is working, we are working as collectively as hard as we can to come up with the right package as soon as possible.
Just tell the House we're going to really have to speed up. Rob Butler.
Mr. Speaker, there are more micro businesses in Buckinghamshire than any other county in the country. I pay tribute to Bucks Business First, which is working extremely hard to try to support them. But can I urge my honourable friend to take the unique needs of micro businesses into account in the measures he's developing?
The honourable gentleman makes an absolutely reasonable point with respect to the nature of the businesses across his constituency, and we need to make sure that we have an effective intervention for all workers.
Deirdre Brock.
Speaker, our farmers, crofters and fishers are crucially producing our food at this time, but this situation has rocked these sectors to their very foundations. Can you outline, please, what specific considerations are being made of possible support for those sectors so they can continue that vitally important work?
Well, the honourable lady will know that there are a large number of the grants and loan schemes that will be accessible to all sectors, and grants from the local authority. There is comprehensive advice went out to all colleagues last night setting out all of that information, and there will be further announcements. In terms of sector-specific issues, they are best addressed through DEFRA, but I hope that the announcements we've made will give some interim comfort to her constituents at this very difficult time.
Matt Weston.
I'm afraid across the chamber it's quite evident that the government has lost the support and confidence, and that's echoed by the markets. We've seen a 5% drop in sterling, which will translate into higher food prices and higher energy prices for already hard-pressed for households. In Warwick and Leamington, we're losing jobs and we're losing good businesses. Will he not support the comments made by the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, and also for Tunbridge Wells, sorry, and introduce some form of universal income support to restore both the supply and demand side?
I acknowledge the points which I think I've responded to previously on the minimum income guarantee. I just wanted to say something in terms of the coordination with the Bank of England. We have worked with the FCA to bring better forbearance measures for the banks so that they can act effectively and use the flexibilities that they have. And obviously, the bridging facility that the Bank of England has brought forward for bigger business is also very important at this time.
Will the Minister assure us that the package measures the government intends to bring forward will offer support to the self-employed, the sole traders and the freelancers who may not themselves be ill but may have already lost work due to the economic disruption of COVID-19?
I can confirm to the honourable gentleman that we're looking at the most comprehensive package that we can bring forward that deals with all sectors and all categories. We want this to be effective to deal with the reality of the challenges that our country faces.
Very specific question with the Minister. Childminders and childcare providers in my constituency tell me that although they have insurance, if they have to close their businesses as a result of a notifiable disease, which clearly COVID-19 now is, insurance companies are saying because it doesn't appear on the list of notifiable diseases, they will not provide the cover. Could the Minister take that up urgently with the industry?
I have taken it up with the industry urgently. Businesses take out business relief, and then about 10% of them take out insurance for non-specified, about 5% take out for non-specified diseases and 5% for specified diseases. Now, what we've done is make sure that for those that have taken out the specified diseases, this will be triggered by the government's announcement this week, and then the other package of measures will support those businesses who don't have that insurance. We can't retrofit contractual obligations to insurance companies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is a decent man, but can I tell him there is a feeling across the chamber that Treasury Ministers and Chancellor in particular find it difficult to empathise really with the situation people find themselves in and don't really speak human very well in this situation. So can I appeal to ministers to show a bit more understanding of the predicament facing people who are freelancers, who are self-employed, who've lost all their work now, and perhaps take on board simple ideas like the member for Tunbridge Wells idea, reverse the polarity. It works usually.
Well, I'm sorry that the honourable gentleman wishes to sort of criticise the tone of my response. I am very clear. This is an unprecedented crisis. The government have made a series of announcements, and we will be making further announcements. A range of sensible suggestions have been made, many of which we are already examining very urgently. In response to specific questions about technical matters, I've had to use quite complex, unfamiliar constructions. If I don't do it that way, I won't have answered the question. If I speak with too many sound bites, I'll be criticised in another way. We will do everything we can to take on board these questions that have been raised today to come forward with a comprehensive package that all of our constituents will see as effective.
Cooper.
I asked the government 10 days ago if they would guarantee the wages, rents and business rates of small businesses. The measures that have been announced are riddled with problems. Businesses in St Albans tell me that they do not qualify for secured loans, they do not qualify for the loans of up to £25,000, and they are being told that the business interruption insurance will only be payable after an event when the insurance company can see how much they have lost. This is not good enough. Businesses are saying HMRC must be used, not the benefit system. We need grants, not loans, and wages for all must be guaranteed and guaranteed today.
Well, I won't reiterate some of the responses I've given in the interest of time, but on the specific insurance point, I'm very happy to look at that as a responsible minister and see what I can do.
Kerry McCarthy.
Can I ask about people using registered childminders who now won't be able to do so? Quite understandably, the childminders are still asking for the fees because otherwise they'd be short. But you've got people who now can't go to work because they've got to look after their children. But if they're self-employed themselves, they can't get money either. What support is available to help them?
The government's very aware of that particular category, and we are looking very carefully at what we can do, and an urgent announcements will be made with respect to that issue.
John Morrow.
Can I say to the Minister as constructively as possible that his government's economic response is undermining the public health response? Job losses are contagious. Fear of economic hardship will spread the virus. The technical details can wait, But he needs to say now today that the principle that he will guarantee the incomes of everyone at a level that provides security.
We will do what it takes to support workers who are in distress. We have brought forward a package of measures, some of which will be imminently delivered, like the unprecedented loan scheme. And then we have also added a number of grant schemes available through local authorities and reliefs from business rates, and additional measures will be coming imminently.
Mr. Speaker, the Links Market is the largest street fair in Europe and has been happening every spring for the last 700 years in Kirkcaldy. Unfortunately, as a result of coronavirus, the Scottish section of the Showman's Guild of Great Britain have had to take the reluctant decision to postpone the event this year. That's going to cause significant hardship for their members. It's also going to have a significant impact on the local economy because of all of the visitors that come at that time. Can the Minister tell us what support will be available to them to get them through this difficult time and preserve their important fair?
The honourable gentleman highlights an example of many colleagues are going to experience, where events that have been planned and have been going on for many, many decades will be cancelled as a result of what's happening. The package of measures that we've announced will be accessible to many of those people. The specific sectors that are involved will sometimes have sector-specific packages where there's been a direct effect as a consequence of government decisions, and a broader package with respect to employees is something that we're urgently working on.
Thank you, Deborah.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Minister will have heard that cross-party consensus here. If the member for Harwich and North Essex and I are in complete agreement on something, something's happening. So on behalf of the 130,000 people of Bristol West, can I plead with him that he will take every single one of these suggestions straight back to the Treasury and put them into practice today, please?
We are working to absorb all ideas that can be actioned, and she can absolutely take my assurance that all ideas from across the House. Now, I brought forward legislation previously in this House building a cross-party consensus, and we would seek to do so on this too.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is very keen to point out that he understands the frustration of members and their constituents. Can I assist him by pointing out it's no longer frustration, it's desperation. What we need is not loans, it's grants. Businesses in Angus are asking me why they should take out a loan to provide incomes for people who cannot work through no fault of their own. That looks dangerously like welfare, and delivering welfare is the responsibility of government. When will government deliver?
I understand the use of the word desperation. I recognise that, and that's why we're working urgently to have a package of measures and extend that package of measures. So there are a range of options to businesses of different size at different situations based on their sector and the risks that they face.
Last but certainly never the least, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just on the news has been confirmed that the first coronavirus death has been confirmed in Northern Ireland. So we wish through this House to convey to that family, and probably everyone here would do the same, our commiserations at this time. I've been contacted by people on 0 hours contracts who normally work 45 hours per week, but have been told that there's now no work for them until further notice. He is a school bus driver. Does the employer in this case not have an obligation to pay his wage and that of others who are in the same boat? What is the Minister's message to help for this employee?
Well, we'd be very happy to look at that individual circumstance. We have made interventions with respect to advances of ESA and removing the minimum income floor. It's absolutely clear that we will need to do more to support employees who have been specifically affected by the tough decisions that we've taken. I'm very sorry to hear of the death of one of his constituents, or the first one from Northern Ireland.
We now come to the ministerial statement, the publication of the Windrush Lessons Learned review. I now call the Secretary of State for the Home Department, Right Honourable Priti Patel.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the long-awaited Windrush Lessons Learned review. I dedicate this statement today to the Windrush generation. I have been personally deeply moved by reading this report. And given the national significance of this issue, I have published this review immediately. And I want to thank Wendy Williams and her team for the important work they have undertaken. Mr. Speaker, the Windrush Lessons Learned review gives voice to members of the Windrush generation who arrived legally to the UK to help rebuild post-war Britain. These are the men and women who built their lives and their home in Britain. These are the people who've done so much for this country, from staffing the NHS to rebuilding Britain. These are the very people who worked hard, paid their taxes, and had every right to be in this country. They contributed to our communities, culture and society, helping our public services and our economy to thrive. They made our country stronger, more vibrant and more successful as a nation. Which is why we were all shocked to discover that they and their families were subject to such insensitive treatment by the very country that they called home. Mr. Speaker, as this review makes clear, some members of this generation suffered terrible injustices, spurred by institutional failings spanning successive governments over several decades, including ignorance and thoughtlessness towards the race and the history of the Windrush generation. Today's publication is part of an ongoing mission to put this right and ensure events like this can never happen again, as there were far too many victims of Windrush. Paulette Wilson was detained in an immigration removal centre and warned she faced removal after living in the UK for 50 years. She spent decades contributing to the UK, working for a time in this very house, and yet she was treated like a second-class citizen. Junior Green had been in the UK for more than 60 years, raising children and grandchildren here. But after a holiday to Jamaica, he was refused re-entry despite holding a passport confirming his right to be in the UK. The injustice that he suffered was compounded when, because of this action, he missed his mother's funeral. Lives were ruined and families were torn apart. And now an independent review has suggested that the Home Office's institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness towards the issue of race and the history of the Windrush generation contributed to this. This is simply unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, I have heard people speak of decision-making as a process that grinds people down to the extent that it makes you want to give up. I have heard people speak of being dismissed, labelled as a group of people who just didn't matter, and whose voice on this issue was irrelevant. People have spoken to me about the indignity and the inhumanity they still feel today by the experience of being made to feel unwelcome in their own country. They have described their experiences as unthinkable and unimaginable. However, Mr. Speaker, there are people across the UK, and even some members of this House, including myself and the Shadow Home Secretary, for whom this is unfortunately all too relatable. There are lessons to learn from the Home Office, but also society as a whole. Despite the diverse and open nature of our country, too many people still feel that they may be treated differently because of who they are or where their parents came from. And today's report, which suggests that in the Home Office there was an institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness towards the issue of race and the history of the Windrush generation, is worrying for us all. In her report, Wendy Williams is clear that lessons must be learned at all levels and by all political parties. She describes a set of measures that evolved under Labour, Coalition and Conservative governments. These measures cover decades. She states that ministers did not sufficiently question unintended consequences and that officials should and could have done more. But we must all look to ourselves. We must all do better at walking in other people's shoes. We must all take responsibility for the failings that led to the unimaginable suffering of this generation. And let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, there is nothing that I can say today which will undo the pain, the suffering, and the misery inflicted upon the Windrush generation. What I can do is say that on behalf of this and successive governments, I am truly sorry for the actions that spanned decades, and I'm sorry that people's trust has been betrayed. And we will continue to do everything possible to ensure that the Home Office protects, supports, and listens to every single part of the community it serves. And Mr. Speaker, action has already begun. In recent months, I have met and listened to people whose lives were shattered. Since 2018, we have launched measures to put right the wrongs caused to individual members of the Windrush generation. We have taken action through practical measures to give those who were affected the assistance, certainty, reassurance and the support that they need. The Commonwealth Citizens Task Force goes into communities to help and support people secure their legal status. Over 11,700 people have been granted a form of documentation that confirms their right to remain in the UK and guarantee their access to public services. Our Vulnerable Persons team has provided support to nearly 1,400 people, with approximately 120 people still receiving support. The team has supported over 360 people to secure access to benefits. And to go some way in addressing the hardships suffered, the Home Office launched the Windrush Compensation Scheme. The scheme was designed in close consultation with members of the community and with Martin Ford QC. Collectively, they have developed a compensation scheme that is straightforward to use, address the bespoke and personal circumstances and the needs of every applicant, with dedicated caseworkers assessing claims as quickly as possible. There is no cap on payments, dozens of which have already been made, and we encourage more applications. Those who are eligible will receive full compensation. Over 100 community events have taken place so far, and this includes more than 30 compensation scheme events across the country, from Southampton to Glasgow, Cardiff to Coventry. But there are still people out there in need of our help who we have not yet reached. And that is why, in February, I extended the length of the compensation scheme by a further 2 years so that claims can be submitted until April 2023. I set up the Windrush Stakeholder Advisory Group to rebuild links with communities to ensure they are supported through compensation, but also to rebuild the trust that has been broken. And today, I can confirm that we will launch an expanded cross-government Windrush working group to develop programmes to improve the lives of those affected. That may be through employment support programmes, dedicated mental health support, and specialist education and training schemes. And to make sure that people know about the task force and the Windrush Compensation Scheme, we will have a dedicated communications campaign promoting this scheme. We will also open a £500,000 fund for grassroots organisations to promote these schemes, including provisions for specialist advice services. I would like to extend my personal thanks to Martin Ford QC for his support with the creation of the scheme. Mr. Speaker, I also want to put on record my thanks to my predecessors, my right honourable friends, the members for Bromsgrove and Maidenhead, and the former member for Hastings and Rye, who worked hard to understand and undo the sufferings when the...
And it is always, I think, very important to be very honest with people, both decision makers and the public, as to what we know and what we don't. And one of the things that you will see when you look at the papers that the Office for Science will be publishing in due course from SAGE is that the science knowledge has evolved through this. So we will answer the same question differently now than we would have 6 weeks ago because there is more science available. So that's just a general point about it. And I just wanted to make one general point about the scientific basis for all of the decision making, because there's a fundamental basis that I think it's worth understanding. When we started out in this epidemic back in January, February, there were broadly two scenarios with multiple subversions of them, which were realistic. The first scenario was this was a major outbreak in China with some spillover elsewhere, that a few cases coming into the UK were a realistic possibility, but it might be that if this was controlled at source in China and there was no spread outside, that this virus going away was a realistic outcome, as happened, for example, for a combination of reasons we understand and, frankly, reasons we don't fully understand with SARS. So that was a perfectly plausible outcome. And the other plausible outcome at the beginning was that this would turn into a widespread epidemic or a pandemic. And we, from the beginning, had science to cover both of those aims. And our original strategy, the contain, delay, research and mitigate strategy, was essentially to cover off both those choices from a science point of view. It is our judgment, and it is my judgment certainly, if you look around the world, the idea that we're going to put this virus back to going away completely, whilst not theoretically impossible, seems so improbable that basing scientific evidence on the theory that that is something we are trying to do seems to me a mistake. And the reason I say that is if what you're trying to do is get rid of an epidemic completely, the most important thing you do in public health terms is you try and find all the cases, isolate all the cases, lock it down, or play for time until you've got a vaccine just comes around the corner. There are a variety of other things you can do, but there's one set of strategies you follow which are based on the principle, actually, we want this epidemic to go away. So, for example, the stuff that we've done recently, We the World, in DRC and previously in West Africa on Ebola, that was predicated on the idea our aim is to get this epidemic to go away. You do completely different things if what you're saying is actually, however much we might like that to happen, and however much we would like there to be a vaccine riding to the rescue in 6 months' time, currently we think that's improbable. So now we've got to work on a different theoretical framework for actually managing this epidemic. And that is important because some of the critique that of the science, which is entirely legitimate, and we are very, both Patrick and I and all of the people involved in this find the critique from the academic community very useful. I mean, the fact is, this is not settled science. Having lots of different scientific opinions is actually a helpful thing, provided it is expressed in a courteous and scientific way rather than just ranting. There is a bit of ranting, and you can work out which ones you think fall into which categories when you read what you hear. But it is useful to have those. But the critiques fall in very broad terms into three groups. There's a group of critiques which are around you've got the right strategy but the wrong timing. And that's actually an entirely legitimate question of debate, which we have debated very, very carefully in the SAGE mechanism. But I think it's important to, I'm trying to be really clear about what are the areas where I think there are scientific critiques. There are a series of very highly technical questions that people say, why not do this and why not do that, which are not, in broad terms, they fit within the framework of what we're trying to do. And then the third set of critiques is, why are you not trying to get this virus to go away using standard methods you use to go away? My own view on this is the science does not support that as the right theoretical framework at this stage of the epidemic. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do at the beginning, and for some countries it may still be the right approach. But I think it is, I wanted to kind of be really clear about where I think the scientific debate is, in a sense, an important debate to have, and where the scientific debate is something which, in my view, I think we're probably not quite in the right stage of this outbreak to be having that discussion.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm going to start with a question from David Adamant Nature. We all know modelling is based on lots of assumptions, uncertainties and provisional information. Do you think politicians get this? Is the information presented properly to the public? Boris Johnson says frequently he bases his decisions on the best science, but the modelling science, although it's the best we have, is far from fallible. Should there be more emphasis on its provisional nature?
Oh, I think there's a lot of emphasis on its provisional nature. I think it's absolutely clear one only has to look at the different inputs to SAGE, the different models come up with different scenarios. So it's very clear it's not absolute science, it's a modelling, it's a prediction, and each of them comes with very wide confidence intervals, and that's been made crystal clear to the politicians, and I think they understand that.
But I think to add to that, I mean, in a sense, models have multiple uncertainties, but one of the uncertainties are the inputs into it, the actual facts, how certain we are about those. And as time has gone by, many of the facts that you have to feed into a model we are now much more confident about. I mean, a classic example is mortality rates. We are really quite confident now about mortality rates. And that's very important for the models, and I think that's not going to change significantly. There are other areas, and I think the one that Patrick and I have repeatedly highlighted is what proportion of people catch this without any symptoms. We do not know the answer to, and could potentially be transformational in the way that you interpret the models. So I think the models are improving because the models are improving, but the models are also improving because the underlying data are improving as well, but with big gaps.
Thomas Moore.
Thomas Moore, Sky News. Chris, a week ago, you were telling people just to sit at home if they had symptoms. This week, you've ramped up social distancing, and yesterday there was a scramble to close schools. What have you seen that's happening in NHS hospitals now that has alarmed you so? Is it general demand, or the particular age groups, perhaps the young, that you hadn't anticipated before? And Patrick, you said at the press conference with the Prime Minister that these would last for 12 weeks. It's clear from the Imperial College work that this is going to have to go on until there is a vaccine, perhaps in 12 to 18 months' time. What hope can you give the British public that there is going to be some intermission in this, that they can enjoy their lives and keep the economy going while still saving lives?
So I think, with all of these, what we've tried to make clear is you move along a pathway, and I'll answer the first one, Patrick will answer the second. So the track of the epidemic has, in a sense, followed the path that we thought in broad terms it was likely to follow. Since we made the decision that this was likely to be a global pandemic, which the WHO have declared officially, so this track is broadly what the modelers would predict, which is a very, very slow initial period. It's doubling all the time, but from very low levels. And then at a certain point, the numbers start to get quite seriously large. The path has followed exactly the path in broad terms. There's always flex around the central projection, but the actual pattern of it is what you would anticipate an epidemic curve to follow. And the question is, what do you do at what stage? And I think what people have got to remember with many of the interventions we have is that they have significant health and social downsides. So stop doing things which actually increase people's social distancing. Sounds fine until you realise that might also increase loneliness. It might, if you're not careful, increase people's inability to get exercise. There are a whole variety of negative consequentials from some of the interventions. And if you do them too early, you get all the negatives, but you get a relatively small or almost non-measurable effect on the epidemic. So a lot of the timing questions are around how far along does it look as if actually the downsides of these interventions are justified by the upsides. But the path of the epidemic has basically followed the pattern we'd have thought. Now, there has been inevitably, because when you start off with an epidemic, you start off with quite sparse data. The actual exactly where you are along the pathway bounces around a bit to begin with, because actually the numbers are small, so quite small numbers either way tend to pull you up or down in terms of where you think you are along the track. But the broad path is in a sense what you'd predict from reading an epidemiology textbook, chapter 1. This is not a radical shift of stance. It is simply moving along a pathway which epidemics tend to start off with as they go up the exponential curve.
Can I just ask about death rates? So you said you're certain about those. Chris Smythe from The Times asks, last week there were 5,000 to 10,000 cases. This week Vallance said 1,000 plus deaths is a reasonable estimate. Yet also they say numbers are doubling every 5 to 6 days. How does all this fit? And Jane Kirby from Press Association says UK death rate so far looks a bit higher than other countries. Is it, and what reasons behind it?
I'll take death rates, but Patrick didn't get the opportunity to answer on the
Sorry,
vaccine.
Thomas.
Do you want the...
Shall I just do, so the 12-week thing is in an unmitigated epidemic, that's roughly what you'd expect it to look like. Obviously, as you press the curve down and you broaden it and you send it to the right, potentially that goes on for longer, but you suppress it below the critical level of intensive care, which is the ambition to do that. In terms of what length this goes on for, I think the priority at the moment is to make absolutely sure we get this as contained in the sense of reducing the peak as we can. Once we're there, that's when I think you start to think about relaxing measures and seeing where we are, and also it's where testing becomes incredibly important as part of the strategy, and where not only testing for active viral infection, but the ability to test with serology, like antibody responses, who's had it. And that will then allow us to be a bit clearer about what the time course is at that stage. But I think we need to, and Chris has said it very clearly, we're dealing with a brand new virus. We're dealing with learning as we go along. And I think now to put absolute timelines on things is not possible. And we can see that in other countries where people are now beginning to experiment with releasing some of the measures a bit to see what happens.
But I mean, I should want to be clear that although the initial upswing of the epidemic will happen, you can then modify it. And that's exactly what we've been trying to do, delay it and push the peak down, and that's very important. On the death rate question, which is clearly a critical question, when we started out, and when you look at SAGE documents, what you'll see is when we started out this epidemic, we had very, very wide uncertainty around what the death rate was, where the upper bounds were really quite high, and the lower bounds were obviously lower. As time has gone by, we've become more and more confident about what the death rate is in people, and realising that it varies quite significantly depending on age group. Now, what you need to do to calculate a death rate reliably is have a group of people who are representative, where you can follow them from the very beginning to the very end, and where they represent the whole spectrum of disease. And one of the reasons that different countries have got different apparent death rates is actually to do with how they tend to calculate their data. So, for example, in the UK at the moment, and this is going to shift very substantially as we move to more testing, but at the moment, the majority of our testing system is based on intensive care cases, people who are in intensive care, and people who've reached hospital. That's, in other words, very much based on the more severe end of the spectrum. Unsurprisingly, we would expect a higher proportion of those people, because we've essentially selected the most severe to have the higher death rate in that group. But that's not representative of all the other people who've not reached hospital and have actually had a mild or moderate disease and have never had to leave their homes. They've been absolutely fine. But the mortality rates that have been calculated around the world, they're based on a full spectrum of clinical disease followed for the full period, so you can be confident from beginning to end. And that's how you do it in terms of calculating, you should do it. The reason I did that rather long answer is there will be a period until we've ramped our testing up in the community when if you just divide the number of cases we identify by the number of people who die, it'll look as if the mortality rate in the UK will be quite high. And I'm predicting this forward. This is not a retrospective point. I'm expecting that to happen. That is because that is the way we're collecting the denominators, is people who got severe or fairly severe disease, rather than all comers. Over time, that will shift.
OK, I've got James Gallagher, Kate Kellan, Nick Triggle, Hugh Pym, ITV, Henry Bodkin, Victoria McDonald, Sean. We're not going to get through these, are we? I'm so sorry, but we'll just keep trying. Right, James, talk quickly.
James Gallagher, BBC News. I'm just wondering, what is the government's long-term strategy for containing the coronavirus? You've basically admitted it's not going away. Are we biding time for a vaccine? What is the exit strategy from all the remarkable social measures that have been put in place? So we've heard a lot about what's the aim in the short term to suppress the peak, keep below the capacity of intensive care. But in the long term, what's the plan?
Are we doing them in a group?
Yes.
Or
No. In one by one.
One by one.
Okay. Yeah.
We have to take so I think that essentially we've got a short, medium and long-term view about this. And the further out in time you go, the more uncertain you inevitably are, back to the point about scientific uncertainty. The short term, the aim is actually to make sure that the peak of this epidemic is firstly pushed to the right. We said right from the beginning we wanted to delay this into the period that the NHS has got a better position to cope than it would do in winter. That's true for all health services. And also to buy us time to actually learn more about this and put the right countermeasures in place. But also importantly to pull the peak down. Now, putting the peak down has several advantages. The most obvious one, in a sense, is it means that the gap between what the health service can deal with effectively and the size of the epidemic is better matched. Because people die in these kinds of epidemics from broadly for two reasons. They die directly of the infection, unavoidably, best care, medical care. This is going to happen, sadly, for some people. That's true for many infections, obviously. But also they can die because the health service they're in is overwhelmed, and therefore there's an indirect death because there's a difference between what they could happen with health and what we're able to provide in this situation. So pulling the curve down really helps from that point of view. But it has an additional advantage, and this is one which is less obvious, less intuitive, which is if you let an epidemic run its full course, you get what's called overshoot, which is where more people get infected than you would need if it was to run at a rather lower peak. And so you actually, by lowering the peak, and this is quite a complicated mathematical point I find not easy to make on air without a chart behind me, but by lowering the peak, you actually reduce the overall number of people who will get the infection because you reduce the probability of overshoot. So that's kind of medium term. Long term, clearly a vaccine is one way out of this, and we all hope that will come as quickly as possible, but Patrick has been very clear, and most scientists who are involved in this have been clear that we don't expect that to happen very quickly, but clearly that's one route out. But there are a number of other scenarios out which are largely based around trying to get it to the point where actually we minimize the probability that at any point the whole system is overwhelmed by this. And then, globally, science will come up with solutions that help to reduce mortality, improve the way we do it. Basically, science will help us over time to get to an optimal position.
A question from Elizabeth Gibney. Can you tell us more info on the serological test? Who's developing it? If people use the test and it shows they've had the virus, can they go out as normal?
So everyone's looking for a serological test. They've got some going in some parts of the world. Public Health England has done a great job of getting something worked up here. There are two types that you should think about. One is one that requires laboratory testing, and the other is a easy-to-use thing that you could use yourself at home. And currently, we're looking at both of those. You've clearly got to have reliability. That's the first thing. And so there's a danger you end up with something that isn't reliable enough. But those tests are being worked up actively as we speak. And if you can get to mass testing, which would definitely be the idea, that does become really useful because it tells you who's had it. It answers the question that Chris raised, which is what is the proportion of people that are asymptomatic, a really important unknown in this. And secondly, it would tell you who's had it and has now got an antibody against it and therefore won't catch it again. And that then becomes important in understanding who's safe to go back and work in certain settings. It enables you to have a much greater flexibility in terms of the NHS. That combined with testing to know who's actively got the virus also frees up staff to be able to do things because you're not isolating people who haven't got the infection. So I think those are the things that are important.
Are we days away from that or weeks or
Well,
months?
I mean, we shouldn't dream that you can scale up to hundreds of thousands of tests in a day. You can't. It's worth saying that on the testing for the virus, the UK has actually been one of the foremost countries in terms of testing. I don't know what the latest number is, but it was over 45,000 last time I looked, and I'm sure it's much higher than that now. And that's been quite an important part of the containment phase and indeed what we're doing now. Ideally, you'd want to go up much, much higher than that, and that takes scaling of assays either in the laboratory or in the home setting, and that doesn't happen overnight, so it's not going to be days.
Kate Calland.
Is the NHS prepared for this if you don't manage to lower the peak and push it to the right? And does it have the right number of, enough intensive care beds and equipment to cope with the patients?
Well, I mean, what you have to say with any health service is, well, firstly, the mitigation strategy for every health service in the world that's looking at this, and that is basically every health service in the world, is broadly comprised of two components. The first bit of which is you pull the peak down, so you reduce the demand, and the second of which is you increase the supply. And there's a lot of work going on in the NHS, and this is a science briefing, not an NHS briefing, so I'm not going to go into details about this, but there will be briefings in due course specifically on this point, because it is a really important point. But there's a lot of things being done, either to reduce demand because we push things which are delayable out beyond the peak, so delay treatments, but also build capacity of the kind that is most relevant to this virus. And that is, in reality, looking at the people who've sadly lost their lives or those who've had very severe disease in other countries, this is primarily around respiratory. So this is levels of oxygenation ranging from just straight an oxygen mask on through to that full-scale ventilation of people, or even something called ECMO, membrane oxygenation. And those two are being built up. Those are being built up, the whole time to try and increase the capacity of the NHS.
Nick Triggle.
Nick Triggle from the BBC. Every year, 500,000 people die. But when we talk about flu deaths, and Sir Patrick mentioned this at the Health Select Committee, 8,000 flu deaths, that's in excess of what you would normally expect, isn't it? Whereas the modelling that was produced talked about 500,000 deaths if we do nothing, 250 if we do mitigation, 20,000 if we do suppression. But they're not excess deaths. They're not above that 500 figure. There'll be some kind of degree of overlap, surely, in the number of deaths you'd expect during the course of the year. And given that that modelling was used to justify the drastic measures that were taken, are you confident we're getting that proportionate, given people are losing their jobs and the economy's tanking? I'm sure you'll mention the NHS capacity, but that modelling set intensive care capacity at 5,000 beds, but NHS England said they can get hold of 12,000 ventilators, so has that been underestimated?
I'll respond, and then Chris, you may want to add. The first thing to say is it goes without saying that all deaths are tragedies for people and their families, and you want to try and minimise that. But you are right, there are 8,000 or so deaths from flu in an average season. It can be more than that in a bad season. And if we can contain this down to the sort of level where it looks comparable to that, which would be a remarkable achievement, then that would be an outcome which is really quite remarkable, given that we haven't got vaccines and other things. So is there an overlap?
That's not quite the question, because 20,000 deaths with this suppression strategy is likely to be way below the 8,000 flu deaths, isn't it, because of the overlap?
Well, there will be some overlap, and we don't yet know how much overlap there will be. And of course, it's true, as has been pointed out repeatedly, that those most at risk are the elderly and those with pre-existing diseases. And so they, of course, in any case, have a higher risk of serious disease over that period. But we don't know the numbers at the moment, and the idea is to try and minimise those and get on top of this for all the reasons that have been described. And a completely uncontrolled epidemic, of course, could give much larger numbers, and that's the reason we have to get on top of it. We must make sure that we get the numbers down to a manageable point. And the NHS capacity is not a trivial point, in the sense that when you really go over capacity, and it's possible, in any winter we go over capacity a bit in some of these ITU beds, but when you go over capacity, if it goes over in a major way, then the whole system grinds to a halt, because you've got a real logjam of trying to look after people. And that's when I think you have other knock-on consequences, all the patients who also can't come into ITU with other diseases. So I think it's not a trivial aim to try and keep that below that level. And the NHS, as Chris has said, is working very hard to try and increase the capacity, because you've got the two things, suppressing the number and increasing the capacity.
Chris, one for you, I think, from Tim Johns at Radio 2. How concerned should we be about further strains of the virus developing?
Well, I mean, with the strong caveat that this is speculative science. But we would expect the virus to mutate, because all viruses do mutate. The question is, are those mutations actually relevant? And I think Patrick might want to give a sort of different answer to this, but I'll give 2 points about this. There is a lot of talk in the chatter on some of the social media sites about, could this virus become more dangerous as it mutates? Whilst theoretically possible, the general tendency is if there's a direction of travel for infections over time, actually they tend to become less virulent over time as they become adapted to a new host. So this is essentially a virus that has jumped the species barrier and is beginning, the risk, what may well happen is it begins to adapt to humans. So there's a question about virulence or non-virulence. We can't predict that. The second question, and this is going to be important for vaccines, is does it mutate in such a way that actually you get a vaccine and then the vaccine, it essentially evolves around the vaccine? And that's an entirely speculative question, and we honestly can't say at this point in time. But those are really the two mutations that are kind of relevant clinically. The third thing that is important, though, is you get lots of very small mutations the whole time, and that allows our colleagues in Public Health England and elsewhere to track family trees of the virus, and that means you can, for example, tell the difference between a very, very localised outbreak and a lot of people who've got unrelated infections from different areas. So the fact there's a little bit of background mutation rate is actually useful to us in the epidemiology to understand what's going on. Patrick, do you want to add to that?
No, the only thing to add is that the UK is absolutely world-class at this type of science, and it's important that we mobilise all of the genomics resources to try and track this, and that will really help in terms of understanding how this outbreak occurs. It'll help in understanding this across the world as well. So I think there is a big scientific challenge here to make sure we get on top of this.
I've got the woman here and then Hugh Pym. Can I have just two more? Is that all right? Please.
Three if they're nice ones.
Three more. Okay, three if they're nice. Sciencey. Can we really go for sciencey questions, not NHS and things like that?
Just one very quick one, if you don't mind. Emily Morgan from ITV News. There's been a huge focus on what the public should do, don't go to pubs, closing schools. But as we know, doctors and nurses are saying they don't have the protective equipment they need. Are you sure that your plan to push the peak back will still work if NHS staff aren't protected?
I'm very happy to answer that question, but not here. Patrick and I were very keen that we actually had the opportunity to give a proper science discussion. I'm in other fora, I'm in front of the media the whole time, totally, and that's not me trying to dodge the question. I'll answer it directly, but I just want this to be a science thing.
I totally agree.
So one comes off the top.
I agree. Hugh, sciencey question. Sean, sciencey question.
It's sciencey to the extent that it's about testing, but not serological testing, virus testing. The government announced a big increase target yesterday. How quickly can you roll out more testing for NHS staff who feel they want to be reassured that they might be able to come back to work or be at work?
Well, that's half sciencey, so
I'll give
it. So I think the honest so for the NHS, the ability to test their staff, our staff, I'm an NHS worker myself, when people are actually unwell and self-isolating, particularly if they've got mild symptoms that mean that they could normally go back to work, is absolutely critical. So there's an incredibly strong incentive in the system to do so, and an enormous amount of effort is being put in to make sure we can do that. Now, clearly, we want to extend it in due course wider than that, but in the first instance, if part of our aim is to protect the NHS, and that is a very large part of what we're trying to do, this is very, very fast down the track immediately after making sure that patients in hospitals have got full testing. Once we've got beyond that, NHS workers being able to come back into the system is an absolute priority.
Sean?
Sean Linton from The Independent. The Imperial paper that sparked a lot of concern from people, and particularly the graph showing the on-off solution that stretched out to November 2021. Chris, you mentioned earlier that there's potentially no way of ever stopping this virus from being around, ever getting it to go away. The Imperial paper is being questioned by some scientists today because it didn't consider containment and isolation of the virus once we were at the bottom of our sort of restricted period, and whether that was an option to actually, if you like, go back to the beginning and try to stop the virus and contain it and kill it. Is that a realistic prospect, or are those scientists wrong?
So Patrick will want to talk about the paper. I'll just give a general public health point about epidemics, which is part of my area of trade. If you've got a global pandemic, which is happening absolutely everywhere in the world, the idea that we can somehow contain it in the UK and then it goes away doesn't strike me as terribly plausible. You just look around the world, look at the maps, and then work out, is this virus going away? And I think that is a self-answering question. And second point on epidemics is you tend to use isolation case finding and isolation, which are really powerful tools. Even in an outbreak, you tend to use them at the beginning when things are on the way up, and at the end when things are at the tail end. And you don't tend to use them if there's a very, very large outbreak in the middle. And that's for a variety of logistical and other reasons. And if you look at how different epidemics have been managed around the world historically, that is a broadly true statement. Now, you can find some exceptions to that, but if you look at a global pandemic, which, we know that there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases in Europe, many people with minimal symptoms. The idea you can find all of those cases, follow all their contacts and isolate them all, I think just think it through. And you don't need to be an epidemiologist to work out that doesn't seem a terribly attractive strategy from a purely practical point of view, leaving aside the science.
Patrick,
I'm not sure I've got anything to add.
Henry Bodkin, and then I'm going to have to finish. I'm sorry. Sorry, Victoria, I'm sorry.
Hi, Henry Bodkin from The Telegraph. My question is about science communication, which is obviously an important part of this. You have explained why this is not like seasonal flu and all of that, but my impression, at least, is that young people in particular, people in their 20s and 30s, just don't get it. They don't get why this isn't like seasonal flu, and that large numbers of people, if the virus is not, if they don't do their job to stop it spreading, will need hospital treatment to save their lives. Do you think your message is landing?
Well, thanks to the fantastic work of the journalists, I am not worried that people in the general public are not aware of this virus. I'm very confident they know they know that this virus is out there. I certainly think people know some things that are true, and they maybe are not aware of some things which we just need to be careful we don't overstate. It is clear that children get this disease much less strongly than adults, but I think the data on that's really pretty strong now. And it certainly is the case that the great majority of those who end up dying, sadly, are people who tend to be either in the later part of their lives, usually quite elderly, or with pre-existing health conditions. But there are also some young people who have ended up in intensive care or have ended up with severe disease around the world. And I think it's important we don't give the impression that every single young and healthy person is just going to breeze through this. The great majority will, and actually the great majority of older people will also have a mild or moderate disease and will get through this. So to be clear, first thing, most people who catch this will have no symptoms, have mild symptoms, or have moderate symptoms, not requiring them to go to hospital. In every age group, only a minority will actually have severe disease, but there will be some young people, a much, much smaller proportion, who will have severe disease even though they are otherwise young and healthy, and we have seen some cases around the world. So I think it's important that we in a sense are clear with people about not trying to say really, really worry, but we also need to be aware that this is not a trivial infection for everybody, even if they are a young adult.
Okay. Can I just add one other thing to that, which is your point is really important, because unless everybody looks at the measures that that have been introduced by the government on trying to encourage social distancing, unless everybody does that, it doesn't have the effect. And so what we absolutely shouldn't encourage is the idea that young people somehow can ignore it because they're going to be fine. And the mixing in pubs and restaurants and so on that we've said is a really part of allowing the disease to spread needs to stop. And it needs to stop amongst young people as well as older people.
It's critical.
Can I just say thank you so much? I think every journalist in this room and online thanked us for organising this briefing, and thanked you for your time. And can I just say, on behalf of all the science and health journalists, if you can come back at any stage, or if you could do these, I've got about 30 more science questions, or find another way of answering some of these. But massive appreciation for you giving us this time. Thank you for coming, and I gather you have...
If people ask science questions and accurately report what we say in the science answers, we'll keep on coming.
Yeah, please do, please do. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry to all those who didn't get their questions answered. Thank you.
no cap on the compensation that will be awarded under the Windrush scheme?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to point to the scheme itself. About the scheme and the way in which it works. There is no cap at all. I'm encouraging and I put a plea to all colleagues in the House here to work with us if they have claimants in their constituency to bring their cases forward. And I do want to thank colleagues who have done that in terms of not just recognising the individuals, but working with the Home Office as well to make sure that we can absolutely who are eligible, make sure that they receive the full compensation.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Mr Speaker, this report and the Windrush scandal itself demonstrates how, under the hostile environment, people who have every right to live in the UK are far too often wrongly denied access to housing and other services, including the NHS. However, ensuring access to healthcare for those who need it is crucial. So in particular, it's vital that no one who needs to be either tested in relation to COVID-19 or indeed seek treatment is put off by uncertainty over their immigration status or fears that they will find themselves detained or reported as a result. So will the Home Secretary therefore guarantee that there will be absolutely no sharing of personal information from the NHS to the Home Office for immigration purposes?
Mr Speaker, I've already made it quite clear that the lessons learned must be learned at every single level from this particular review. She's raised a very important point about COVID-19, access to public services and public health. That is not an issue, as far as I'm concerned, that we will need to deal with, because when it comes to the Windrush generation and the individuals that we have been speaking about and involved in this particular review, they will be able to access the public services and the public funds in the way in which I've spoken about today.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Windrush generation were British. They should not have been caught up in our immigration system, but they were. And the Home Secretary's apology and use of the past tense remain unconvincing, whilst the hostile environment which they experienced is still in place. The All-Party Parliamentary Group for Africa, which I chair, reported on the disgraceful treatment of African visa applicants, and as a constituency MP, every day I see delay, neglect, discrimination and stereotyping in Home Office processes. So will the Secretary of State say today that our immigration system must not only be fair and fast, it must also be welcoming, and that is the standard to which she will hold herself?
First of all, Mr Speaker, Wendy Williams describes in this review a set of measures that evolved under a number of governments over many decades. And clearly, we all need to move on and look at... Let me finish. And I will look at the review and recommendations if she patiently waits me to finish my sentence. I have been very clear in terms of the work that I will be undertaking within the Home Office now, in terms of reviewing policies, but also policies that relate to the compliant environment and cultural change. I have been consistent in my time as Home Secretary about having, yes, a firm but fair immigration policy to make sure that we are welcoming to people that can come to the United Kingdom and contribute to the United Kingdom. And I think that is exactly the signal that our country should be sending to everyone across the world.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Home Secretary now beginning to understand how fundamental and profound is the breach of trust in the Home Office that stems from from the Windrush scandal. In my constituency, there are Windrush citizens who are fearful of coming forward to claim compensation because of that breach of trust, and many more who live in daily fear of the possibility that their lives might also be ruined by the Home Office. Specifically, they live in fear of ending up on a charter flight. As recently as last month, the Home Office was having to remove passengers from a charter flight because it had not followed due process. Will she commit to pause charter flights and suspend them until the Lessons Learned review has been implemented in full? Will she also join me in paying tribute to the Black Cultural Archives on Windrush Square in my constituency, who have played an exceptional role in stepping forward to provide support for Windrush citizens when grassroots funding was being called for but was not provided by the government? And will she confirm that the BCA will now be funded to do their vital work of helping to enable Windrush citizens to come forward to claim the compensation for which they are eligible?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I've been very clear today in my statement with regards to not just the Lessons Learned review, but the changes that need to come forward. That is not an overnight revelation. I have been working within the Home Office. She would have heard in my statement as well the work that I have undertaken with members of the Windrush generation, with the advisory group, with the compensation group as well, to understand many of the issues, the challenges, the injustices that I have heard and experienced at first hand, as no doubt she has, in terms of how we can address them directly. The Honourable Lady has also heard me speak today, and I can confirm again that we are announcing a grassroots fund, £500,000 grassroots fund, to help with, obviously, the support and the dissemination of information that will support members of the Windrush generation and others that may have been caught up in this and some of the policies and the processes of the past too. It is quite clear that going forward there is a great deal more work to do. She asked about deportations. I can give her an assurance that in her reference to the flight that departed several weeks ago, there was no one from the Windrush generation on that flight. And not only that, that deportation took place under the UK Borders Act 2007, introduced by this House of Commons under a previous Labour government.
Speaker, the Home Secretary has already acknowledged that the Home Office has not investigated the impact on those from Commonwealth countries outside the Caribbean and excluded from consideration those with a criminal record who were wrongly deported. Can she confirm that the research will now be extended, as I think Wendy Williams recommends? And will she ensure that sufficient resources are made available so that the work is actually carried out as soon as possible?
Speaker, I'll say to the Honourable Lady that I'll be looking in detail at every recommendation that Wendy Williams has put forward, and I'll be working with her on the delivery of many of them.
Stephen Timms. Mr. Speaker, 6 years ago, over 30,000 overseas students from Commonwealth countries lost their visas when they were accused by the American firm ETS of cheating in its TOEIC English language test. It's since become clear that many of those accusations, in fact almost certainly most of them, were without foundation. In learning the lessons of Windrush, will she ensure that those students who are innocent get an affordable route to clear finally their names?
Excellent. Speaker, my honourable friend has raised this point with me previously, and I thank him again for raising it today. I will look into this, absolutely. He has asked me to do so, and that is something that I will absolutely take away.
We now come to business statement. Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, the business for the week commencing the 23rd of March will include Monday, the 23rd of March, consideration of a business of the House motion, followed by all stages of the coronavirus bill. Tuesday, the 24th of March, committee and remaining stages of the Windrush Compensation Scheme Expenditure Bill, followed by motion relating to appointments to the Parliamentary Works Sponsor Body, followed by general debate on the situation in Yemen. The subject for this debate was determined by the Backbench Business Committee, followed by, if necessary, consideration of Lord's amendments. Wednesday, the 25th of March, if necessary, consideration of Lord's amendments, followed by Opposition Day, 7th allotted day. There will be a debate on a motion in the name of the official opposition, followed by, if necessary, consideration of Lord's amendments. Thursday, the 26th of March, if necessary, consideration of Lord's amendments, followed by debate on a motion on errors in payments made to victims of the Equitable Life scandal, followed by debate on a motion on human rights in Kashmir. The subjects for these debates were determined by the Backbench Business Committee, followed by, if necessary, consideration of Lord's amendments. Friday, the 27th of March, private members' bills. The provisional business for the week commencing the 30th of March will include Monday, the 30th of March, consideration of Lord's amendments, if necessary, followed by second reading of the non-domestic rating public lavatories bill, followed by, if necessary, consideration of Lord's amendments. Tuesday, the 31st of March, matters to be raised before the forthcoming adjournment. The subject for this debate was determined by the Backbench Business Committee.
Valerie Vaz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Leader of the House firstly for consulting with opposition parties last week on Westminster Hall debates, which I know that he hasn't announced, and also to say that we are in unprecedented times and I appreciate things are moving fast, and I hope you continue to consult. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for the statement you made yesterday when the Chancellor first gave his statement to the press rather than to Parliament. Parliament must be told first we are not irrelevant. And I note the Chancellor apologised and gave you an assurance, but he didn't actually say he was not going to do it again. Could I ask the Leader of the House, when press conferences are made, just to say that, to give all the information in the press conferences, what's happening is that journalists are being briefed afterwards, and important information is then highlighted under breaking news rather than at the press conference. I want to, Mr. Speaker, thank all the staff, because we are in a skeleton staff, and those who've made arrangements so that they can service Parliament. Could I ask the Leader of the House if the parliamentary staff are key workers so they too can be supported with childcare and other benefits? And also, does he agree with me, and could he confirm that no one has to use their holiday entitlement when they're self-isolating or when they're sick? Hopefully they'll get sick pay, but I think there is an issue that they may be using up their holiday entitlement. Mr. Speaker, we were in a good position to learn from other countries. After all, China built their hospitals in 2 weeks. Though in Italy has tested a lot, and we know that asymptomatic people, of which there may be many here, can still transmit it. They are now virus-free. But I'm pleased that the Leader of the House has taken on board the suggestion that I made last week. The government and the BBC have looked to ensure that the over 75s don't have to pay for their television licence fees. I note that it's only until August, but all the other packages that have been mentioned will take place over 12 months. Now, the Education Secretary yesterday said he wanted to work with the BBC to ensure that our children can learn while they're at home, and also for exercise for seniors while we're all self-isolated. So it shouldn't be right that the BBC have to foot that bill. They need to be compensated for any loss of income. I want to ask the Leader of the House if he can, as much as he can, confirm that we will be back on the 21st of April. We know the Environment Bill is in committee. I wonder if he could make a statement on the timetable of those bills and the Brexit negotiations. We're all going to, if we self-isolate, are going to be indulging in the creative industry, music, television, films, as we self-isolate. I know that he knows that most of them are self-employed. Now, many of them have had concerts cancelled, and we need to have a proper package for them so that they don't lose out. There is some confusion because insurers are cancelling this and citing force majeure, and we know that the Department of Health has said that this is a notifiable disease, so could he please clarify that? I have a constituent who had a stroke, and she's been asked for a sick note by her Human Resources Department, but the GP's not giving her one. Could he clarify whether sick notes are needed? And I appreciate that the emergency legislation will be published later today, or perhaps it has already been published. There is a sunset clause of 2 years. I would urge caution, because this is, after all, the government that was found to have acted unlawfully over the prorogation. It's important both that there is a shorter sunset clause and that if the Leader could again confirm that Parliament will return on the 21st of April. Can I make a helpful suggestion in that there are lots of issues coming out of each different department, and I just wonder if a statement could be made with each department and their package, and that's published on gov.uk with a dedicated helpline so that we don't have to trouble a minister, say for example from the Department of Health, and ask them questions about employment rights. But those people will know that, I know that the government don't want to appear on the Today programme, but the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown had some very important words today, and I think those should be heeded. I wonder if the government could look at ensuring there are experts from other fields. After all, he and Alistair Darling had been through the economic crisis caused by the banking crisis, as well as flooding when he was Prime Minister. And what he said was very important. We're not here to protect our institutions, but our people. So please, could we ensure that? Excellent news, and I want to thank the leader for all the efforts that he made and the diplomatic efforts on freeing Nazanin. She's out for 2 weeks, albeit with a tag that she and her family have had to pay for. But 85,000 prisoners have been released. Anousheh is not among them, neither is Kylie, both dual nationalists. Could I ask the leader again to raise their case? They need to be back home where we can help them with this if they have coronavirus, which we know exists extensively in Iran. Mr. Speaker, one of the good things that have come out of these fabulous community groups that have been set up to help people. We know that the Communication Workers Union, the post office workers are going to every house and they're helping with deliveries. The firefighters in Manchester are going to ring elderly people often. Let's keep our spirits up. Tomorrow is the first day of spring.
The House.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady is right to keep our spirits up and to remind us that tomorrow is the first day of spring, and I hope that will put a suitable spring in our step. I'm very grateful for the support that has been given to the government in these difficult times by the opposition, by the Right Honourable Lady herself, by the Leader of the Opposition, and particularly by the Shadow Health Secretary, who has been working very closely with the government and, of course, to the opposition chief whip, who is invariably a means of ensuring that mechanisms within this place work. So I'm very grateful in all those cases. I'd like to record my thanks to Parliamentary Council for the phenomenal work they have done in bringing forward the emergency legislation that will be presented later on today. They have been working all weekend and late into the night to ensure that the bill could be drafted. And I note the point that is made on the sunset clause. I think we want to maintain cooperation with all parties across this House. That point will have been noted, and I'm sure there will be discussions over the weekend with relation to that, but it's not for me to make commitments, but I'm genuinely grateful for the support. On statements to this House, the Chancellor did indeed apologise and for not making the statement here first. He was bringing forward financially sensitive information, which can be more difficult than other statements, but I'm glad to say the Education Secretary made his statement here first before the press conference. It is not an easy issue because we need to inform the country at large, but we need to maintain parliamentary accountability at the same time. We are obviously going to work very closely with you, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Parliament is kept properly informed and that we don't find things out purely from news reports. But it is important to get information out to the country at large as well. With regard to our return on the 21st of April, it is very important that Parliament continues to sit. The position of Her Majesty's Government is that Parliament will continue to sit. I think this is of significance, that we need to be held to account, but we also need to be able to legislate. And with regard to bills that are currently in committee, we will be able to ensure that those continue in committee as long as the House is sitting, but we may have to have discussions on precisely how the House operates. The Leader of the Opposition asks about voting arrangements. May I thank the Opposition for not calling divisions this week, which has been helpful under the current circumstances. And I think we need to work closely to see that the mechanisms we use are effective and actually ensure that we hold the government to account, that we legislate properly, but we will have to look at this, and I don't think it's right to make immediate decisions from the dispatch box now, but let's see what the situation is when we come back on the 21st of April. But it has to be something that is agreed on a cross-party basis that that is of fundamental importance to how this House works. With regard to sick notes, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for mentioning this to me in advance. As I understand it, sick notes can now be given by going online with 111, so that people won't need to get them from their doctors, though I would reiterate the government's encouragement to businesses to be flexible about this, that British business is in many ways leading the way. One hears all sorts of pieces of good news, and BP is offering free fuel to emergency service vehicles and things like that. Business is being community-spirited, and I would encourage the business in the specific case she mentions and in other similar cases to behave in that way. The Right Honourable Lady makes very good points about the centralisation of information. It is important that we have a reasonable balance between constantly bombarding ministers and getting information that is straightforwardly available already, and the more it's collated, the better that will be. That's an extremely valid point, as is the point about the expertise of others. I also heard the interview with Gordon Brown, and he had many interesting things to say, and I can assure the House that the government is taking suggestions from a wide range of sources. As you can imagine, ideas are pouring in to the government, and that is welcome. I wanted to say on the over 75s, the noble Lord Hall, was on the radio this morning, and he was saying that that was under review, and that therefore it is not an August deadline and that's it. It was a decision that is made until then, but they will consider it further, though I think we're going to have the opportunity of watching lots of repeats if we are staying at home. But then there are some wonderful programmes that were made not so many years ago, so that won't be too much of a burden, I would have thought. And I share the Right Honourable Lady's pleasure about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. It is really very good news that she has been released. And to update the House, the Foreign Secretary spoke to the Foreign Minister Zarif on the 16th of March about all the dual national cases. So the government is continuing to push. And one piece of good news is welcome. Let us hope there's more good news to come.
Sir David Evans.
Will my right honourable friend find time for a debate of the treatment of UK nationals held in prisons overseas? Last month, I went with my constituent, Mr Sandu, to see his son held in prison in Prague for alleged offences of fraud. The family very much want the government to intercede to see if their son can be released on bail.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I welcome my own friend back to business questions. We have missed him, and I'm glad that he is not forced to be staying at home and is therefore able to raise this point. Consular staff are providing assistance to Mr Sandhu's son, and the FCO has set out how they can help in their publications available on gov.uk. These are called Support for British Nationals Abroad, a Guide, and Arrested Abroad. We can consider intervening with the local authorities if a detainee is not treated in line with internationally accepted standards or with consent to raise concerns about mistreatment. However, as the Honourable Gentleman will understand, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office cannot interfere in the judicial and legal processes of another country. So we can make representations, but we can't force. But my honourable friend is right to raise this issue.
Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Last night I was due to speak at an event for which more than 300 people had registered. And because of the crisis, the organisers took the event online. And all of those people were able to participate from the convenience and indeed safety of their own homes. What surprised me was that the hardware I required to do that was none other than the standard issue iPad, which I was given 5 years ago by this Parliament. And I say this because it convinces me that the technology is available for us to continue to have informed democratic debate without the necessity of having to meet in this chamber. And I want to ask the Leader whether or not he is considering procedures that, whilst alongside things like changing our standing orders to reduce the attendance required to make legislation, there are also mechanisms whereby people can represent their constituents and press the case that they want to do on behalf of the people who elected them without the necessity to actually attend the Parliament. And I think we need to do a lot more on that. With regard to the emergency legislation, which we shall see shortly, I wanted to ask a specific point as to whether that will give the government the scope to take action against some people who are engaged in quite disreputable behaviour at this point in time. Because whilst This crisis, the public response to it, has brought out the best in people. There are some instances where it has brought out the worst as well. Many people will be shocked at the fact that there are private medical companies profiteering by charging exorbitant fees for testing at this point in time. I believe such people should be detained and their assets should be commandeered and put to the public good. I wonder if the emergency legislation will give the government the powers to act in that way. With regard to the debate which we've been having about universal basic income or a minimum income guarantee, which many people feel is essential to avoid perhaps millions of people approaching the DWP for benefit claims, the Prime Minister yesterday gave a guarantee that he would meet with others and bring forward proposals on that. Can I ask when we might expect a statement to the House from the Prime Minister on that, and when such a meeting will take place? And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, can I say that at this point in time, I do think it seems rather surreal and fanciful to be planning to meet not just next week in full, but the week after. Should we not now be taking steps in order to wind down our formal processes and go to the Easter recess at the end of next week? Would that not be the sensible course of action and indicate leadership to everyone else in the country at this time?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for the tone and interest of the proposals that he makes. I think everybody is open to ideas as to how things may be done differently and needs on attendance. I have received a letter, or Mr Speaker has received a letter from the Chairman of the Procedure Committee setting out options for how select committees may be able to carry on with their important business without meeting in person. And therefore, Parliament will be considering what steps can reasonably be taken that allow things to be done remotely. I think it may be difficult to recreate this chamber remotely, but certainly with select committees there are options and they are being considered. The government shares the honourable gentleman's concern about people profiteering from a crisis and is aware that some people are behaving extremely well and others are using this as an opportunity. And one has heard of stories of people charging exorbitant prices for hand sanitizer, loo roll and so on. So his issue is one that the government is aware of and will act if it is necessary. As yet it doesn't seem to be so widespread a problem as to require government action, but the government is not ignoring this point. On the universal basic income, the government is willing to consider all ideas, and lots of ideas are coming in. I would say on this the priority is to proceed with things that can be implemented rapidly and for which systems already exist. It may prove difficult to introduce entirely new systems, but I'm sure that the Prime Minister, having said he is open to meetings on this matter, will prove open to meetings on this matter. As regards the point on the week after next, the House voted for the recess dates, but the House can obviously vote for new recess dates. I would say that we want to maintain flexibility because I can't make an absolute guarantee that all the emergency legislation that could possibly have been thought of is in the bill coming before the House today. There may be other things that we need to legislate on, and there is also demand for scrutiny. So we have to get this balance right, and nothing will be done without consulting the opposition parties, and I emphasise plural.
David Davis.
I say to my right honourable friend that I think the opposition has a serious point in terms of the duration of the emergency legislation, particularly given that it appears we're only going to debate it for one day. There is a qualitative difference between a single-day debate on major legislation and even a two-day debate. Now, I know the Upper House has different constitutional arrangements, but can he tell us what the amount of time he expects them to spend on considering this legislation before they send it back to us?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I note the point that my right honourable friend makes. The government is aware of this point. The bill needs to progress with support in this House. Emergency legislation is best done and only tends to go through successfully when there is a very widespread consensus. So his point is a very important one. I can't, unfortunately, and it, I think wouldn't be right of me, to try and say what proceedings will be in another place. I think that would be slightly impertinent of me to say what their lordships will do.
Noel Turner.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. There is a lot of rivalry in a rugby league, especially in Hull, where we are blessed to have two Super League teams, Hull FC and Hull Kingston Rovers. It's clear that rugby league clubs need a special scheme of support. I've spoken with both club chairmen yesterday evening, and they're very worried about the survival as clubs as a result of COVID-19. Can we please have a statement from a minister on what plans there are to financially support rugby league clubs at this incredibly worrying time? Not so that they can survive to next week, next month or next year, but for the next 125 years as they've previously existed.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I think a lot of businesses, a lot of sporting activities are worried. I would reiterate what the Chancellor has said, that everything that can be done will be done to ensure the stability of the economy through this period and to ensuring that businesses that are well-founded are able to continue.
Teresa Villiers.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Tomorrow, thousands of businesses across the country who provide childcare and nursery services have been asked to shut their doors for an indefinite period. Can we have a debate on what we do to help the childcare sector through this very difficult period to ensure that we have a successful, thriving and high-quality nursery provision for the years ahead?
Yes, Mr Deputy Speaker, there are inevitably concerns following the announcement yesterday of the closures that will take place, that the government is working with providers of all levels of education to ensure that they are aware of the situation and that they are helped to cope through it. And I understand there will be further announcements being made during the course of today.
Lillian Greenwood.
Mr Deputy Speaker, will he take this opportunity to thank everyone working on our transport networks, on our buses and trains, driving delivery vehicles and so on? And does he recognise that there are real concerns about the impact on the reduction in passenger flights, not only the impact on travel businesses and on aviation workers, but also for the movement of essential goods which are usually carried in the hold of passenger planes? When can we expect a statement from the Secretary of State for Transport so that we can raise this and many other concerns?
Mr Deputy Speaker, yes, of course I would be willing to thank everybody in the transport sector who is working so hard. It is interesting to note that in terms of how society has developed, the delivery drivers for supermarkets are unquestionably key workers who are playing an incredibly important role, particularly with those who need to stay at home, and from next week for those with particular medical conditions who are going to be encouraged to be shielded. And the work they are doing is making it possible for people to carry on with their lives as far as possible. So it's very important work. As regards the flows of trade in the bellies of aeroplanes coming in, yes, that is an important point. I think there is such demand for ministerial statements that many of them will need to be written statements rather than oral statements.
Senator Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his response to the front bench spokesman for the Scottish National Party in terms of how this House should operate. Can I connect two issues, which is the scrutiny of emergency powers and the need for public confidence in their exercise, and the role of select committees? When does he think he will be in a position to announce to the House what the arrangements for select committees will be? Because if these emergency powers are to be exercised, select committees can sit when the House is not sitting and provide some democratic oversight of how these powers are being exercised.
If I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, perhaps it's helpful to explain how we came to agreement on Westminster Hall being suspended, to give an example of how we are intending to work. That there was a letter from the Clerk of the House to the Speaker. The Speaker consulted me. I consulted with the Right Honourable Lady and with the representatives of the Scottish National Party. We consulted with the chairman of the most relevant select committees, and then we came forward with a motion. It is very important that what we do for select committees similarly has cross-party support and consensus across this House, because I think for the Leader of the House, representing the government, to come forward with proposals for how select committees should operate, people might think that that was designed not to enhance but to reduce scrutiny, and therefore it is of the utmost importance this is done with consensus, and therefore it will take a little bit of time, a few days, to discuss these matters, but proposals will be brought forward.
Colin Harris.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've received urgent communication in the last hour from the leading funeral operators in the UK who tell me there is a reluctance with the Cabinet Office to include funeral care workers on the list of essential employees. It is inconceivable that this industry will be short-staffed at this time. Can the Leader of the House please make urgent communication with his Cabinet colleagues to make sure that the funeral industry is on the list of essential workers? Thank you.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady always makes the most important points in this House, and I always find myself in agreement with her. There's no difference on this occasion. I will take it up immediately after this session.
Richard.
Mr Deputy Speaker, you will know that many colleagues have constituents abroad, many of them desperate to get back home. When can we have a debate on price gouging and bring forward, perhaps in the emergency legislation, price gouging legislation? Most airlines are trying to help to do their bit, but there are some examples of real egregious price gouging which are preventing people from coming home. I think the British people find it very difficult to swallow if the airlines want us to bail them out and at the same time hiking up prices of people that need to come back home.
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend raises a very sensible point. The Foreign Office is working very closely with the airlines to ensure that people can be brought back home, and the Department of Transport is working closely with them as well. I would make a general point, which goes back to what was said by the spokesman on behalf of the SNP, that businesses are in some cases behaving very well. And businesses will, I think, want to maintain the support of the community in what they do. And regardless of government intervention, they would themselves be well advised to maintain the goodwill of the British people.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. To follow on the point about select committees, can the Government please bring forward next week both of the motions to establish the Liaison Committee and the Scottish Affairs Committee? I know we've had our differences about this, but we need to have these scrutinising mechanisms in place going forward.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm obviously aware of the points made. Both of those committees were prevented from being set up by actions within this House, so the Government is inevitably deliberating on the consequences, and I think the priority is to ensure that the select committees that are already set up can operate, rather than necessarily on ones that aren't yet set up.
Julian Lewis.
In difficult times, we should remember those who sacrifice most. So may we have a statement or debate on the substance of EDM 280 about the scandal of war widows who lost their pensions on remarriage, and on EDM 307, more positively, about the enhanced cooperation between Blind Veterans UK and the Blinded Veterans Association of America, who are setting up a new combined eye trauma task force, and look for the government support in that matter.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Government recognises the unique commitment that service families make to our country and remains sympathetic to the circumstances of those widows who remarried and cohabited before the 1st of April 2015. However, the Government currently has no plans to reinstate war widows' pensions for war widows who remarried or cohabited before the 2015 change took effect. And the Defence Secretary stated in the House on the 3rd of February 2020 that the Department is examining alternative methods to see whether we can mitigate the impact of these changes. There is always a difficulty, Mr Deputy Speaker, with cut-off dates. As regards to the cooperation between the US and the UK in relation to blindness and eye problems, what the Honourable Gentleman suggests sounds extremely worth looking into, and I will sure it is taken up with the Department.
Christine Matheson.
Further to the question from the Honourable Gentleman from the Region, I have constituents who are stranded as far apart as the Philippines and Peru at the moment. They've been told to contact the embassies, but the embassy staff have rightly been sent home, and contact with the embassies is about nigh on impossible. There is spare capacity in the airlines at the moment, so can we have a statement either from the Transport Department or from the Foreign Office, or better still both, about how we're going to bring our stranded people back home?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I can assure the Honourable Gentleman that this is at the forefront of what the Foreign Secretary is doing. I heard him say that only this morning. He is making sure that people who are in difficulties in remote areas receive as much support as the Foreign Office can possibly give.
Freya.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. First, I'd just like to thank Mr Speaker through yourself for the pace at which he brought forward the changes to the way we operate here in terms of social distancing and the practices here. I think that was the right thing to do. It seems to me that given the scale and the pace of the coronavirus spread and the threat to life and to health, to incomes and to jobs across the country, it's quite right that the government bring forward this emergency legislation briskly and wants to see it through the House briskly. But it's equally right that Parliament has the opportunity to scrutinise the legislation. I just had a couple of questions along these lines. The first is there a particular reason why the Civil Contingencies Act wasn't used, which does contain many of the safeguards I suspect the House will wish to see anyway? Secondly, if the emergency legislation does pass the House, which I hope it does given the circumstances, with possibly a few modifications, what other opportunities will there be for this House to question the particular measures? Because this is very dynamic and very fast moving, and literally within 48 or 72 hours it may well be that one of the measures adopted results in maybe 1 million, 2 million unemployed people with nowhere for them to go. So just what other opportunities will there be for this House to very quickly hold the government to account should it prove necessary?
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Civil Contingencies Act unfortunately would not have worked in these circumstances because the problem was known about early enough for it not to qualify as an emergency under the terms of the Act. And therefore the legal advice is that if, or legal experts say, that if you can introduce emergency legislation, you should do so rather than using the Civil Contingencies Act, because you've got time to introduce emergency legislation. You obviously knew about it long enough in advance for the Act not to apply. So that is why that Act could not be used. With regard to future scrutiny, it is one of the reasons it is so important that we keep the operation of this House going, to which, as I've said before, the government is committed, to ensure that scrutiny takes place. The government of this country is the executive and the legislature. It is not purely the executive, and we need to ensure that the legislature is operating efficiently, even if it has to operate differently, to ensure that we carry out our proper role.
Lynn Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My constituent who is trapped in Peru is being advised by the British Consulate to apply for a place on a private flight at a minimum cost of $3,000. When a member of my casework team challenged this advice and suggested that my constituent may not be able to access $3,000 easily, she was told by the representative at the British Consulate, "Do they want it to be free then?"
Dear, oh dear.
Mr Deputy Speaker, this is not consistent with the sentiment that the Leader of the House recently expressed, that the Foreign Secretary is doing everything within his power to bring our citizens home. Will he ask the Foreign Secretary to come to this House and to explain the lack of capacity in British consulates overseas and the appalling attitude that is being taken by some of his staff, and explain how he is going to ensure that our vulnerable citizens stranded overseas can come home during this pandemic?
Yes, well.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to reassure the Honourable Lady that the Foreign Secretary is, as I said earlier, taking this issue with the greatest seriousness. I think it is a little unfair to pick on one example of an offhand comment and assume that that is the general way consulates behave. Consulates are deeply stretched because of this, the numbers involved and the nature and unexpectedness of this crisis. And dare I say that all of us have come to a realization of the seriousness of this crisis over time, and that therefore some replies are getting better as time goes on, as the necessity becomes clearer, and that the Foreign Secretary is certainly working very hard on this.
Vice Elwood.
Mr. Speaker, the Defence Select Committee wants to meet on Tuesday. It won't be doing so. We have the witnesses in place, but they can't virtually beam themselves in. I hope that can be corrected so we can, in fact, go to a digital environment. Could I invite the front bench to give us a statement on military assistance to civil effect, the COVID support force? We have 20,000 Armed Forces personnel that are on standby, mobilised to assist in this coronavirus outbreak. They will do a terrific job, but what will that job be? There's speculation they might be involved in the the shutdown of London. We know that's incorrect. On top of that, they have a day job to do, to watch our backs, to keep our nation safe. With that in mind, and with the ever-increasing pressures that will be placed on them as this coronavirus outbreak continues, could I ask the front bench to consider delaying the defence, foreign policy and security review until the new year?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, select committees need to think carefully about how they are going to approach their business before any specific arrangements are made. The one thing I would say that is the greatest drain on House resources are public evidence sessions because of the requirement for Hansard reporters, for broadcasting and so on. And I would ask the chairman of select committees to be considerate in what they are planning for public sessions. Private sessions require much less in terms of House resources. As regards assistance from the military, I understand there is a written ministerial statement being laid by the Ministry of Defence today. I agree with my right honourable friend that the service provided to us by our armed forces in all circumstances is really truly remarkable and inspirational. And I'm glad he raised some of the wilder stories that were circulating yesterday. May I encourage all honourable and right honourable members to listen to official sources of information. Some of the things going around yesterday seemed merely to be said to make the flesh crawl, and I think it is much better to listen to the calm responses that we're getting at the press conferences from the Chief Medical Advisor and the Chief Scientific Advisor as to what is actually happening.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I am worried for the many vibrant and unique pubs, clubs and music venues in Newport West. Their insurance policies cover a long list of notifiable diseases, but COVID-19 is not one of them. Sam Dabb, the owner of the Le Pub, a cooperative pub and music venue in Newport City Centre, told me that without government intervention, my business will not survive, and most people in the hospitality industry are in the same boat. So can the Leader of the House tell us when he expects the government to announce what support will be provided to those businesses whose insurance policies do not cover COVID-19 in their notifiable diseases?
Exactly right.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to raise this point, and the Chancellor has said he will do whatever it takes, and I think that is an important commitment. I would say with regard to insurance companies, the scale of the problem that we have got is one that, if just moved to the insurance companies, would have an effect on the insurance companies. And therefore, I think we need to look at what the government is doing and the overall approach of the government, and take the Chancellor's words that he will do whatever it takes to heart.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Chairman of the Backbench Business Committee, the Honourable Member for Gateshead, is away on constituency business. So on behalf of the committee, can I ask my right honourable friend what provisions are going to be made for reopening Westminster Hall debates, because that is a major part of the allocation the Backbench Business Committee has, or alternatively, further time in this chamber for debates. On my behalf, Mr. Speaker, I've alerted to my right honourable friend in advance that most of us weren't using hand sanitisers until a few weeks ago. The reality is that I've seen evidence of the trebling of prices to retailers by wholesalers. It's not clear that it's been passed on by manufacturers, but wholesalers are clearly profiteering from these hand sanitisers, and then retailers are then left with the unenviable choice of passing on that increase with a small margin. So can we have a statement by the government on what is going to be done to prevent this unfair profiteering that is taking place at a time of national emergency?
Yes, Mr Deputy Speaker. I will answer both questions. With regard to Westminster Hall, we will have discussions about its reopening as soon as that is practicable. There is a commitment to reopen it, and we will have similar discussions to the ones we had to close it about reopening it. I would say it is particularly at this time, with not all ministers being available, the pressure has been greater than normal, but that will abate in due course. With regard to profiteering and racketeering, my honourable friend is right to raise this immoral practice, and I would call on wholesalers to exercise better judgment. The government is keeping a close eye on such activity, as I said earlier, and will act if necessary. There are some people who always feel that the right thing to do in difficult times is to get involved in profiteering. They should think about that twice and not do it.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I don't know if the leader heard this morning his colleague from the Treasury answering an urgent question, but it was quite clear that the government is struggling, obviously in these exceptional circumstances, to come up with policies and guidance and to get information out to the public around support for workers and families. So on that basis, could I just suggest gently to the Leader of the House that putting onto the order paper for coming days things like the second reading of the non-domestic rating public lavatories bill is not what this Parliament should be focusing on at the moment. We should be having statements from ministers so members of Parliament can raise the issues that their constituents are bringing to them on a daily basis, rather than starting legislation which is not vital in these exceptional times.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we have had statements from the Chancellor, from the Education Secretary, and regular updates from the Health Secretary to keep the House up to date. And I would emphasise the word provisional. The business for the week after next is, as always, the provisional business, and that which is provisional is not set in stone.
Anderson. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. During times of national emergency, the media play a vital role in delivering information to concerned viewers, listeners and readers. Scrutiny is good, but undermining the national effort by spreading misinformation helps nobody and creates panic among some of the most vulnerable members of our society. Can my right honourable friend raise this issue with broadcasters such as ITV, where Piers Morgan, who has no scientific or medical qualifications, seems to want to make irresponsible comments on a daily basis?
Mr Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his question, and he's right to point out the role that the media plays in informing the public and holding the government to account. But commentators and the media, Michael Crick is indeed brilliant. I hear a chunter from the opposition benches, and somebody I particularly admire, one of the best journalists at keeping people to account. But one does not have to take every utterance from controversialists as holy writ. That Piers Morgan enjoys causing a row, and I think, frankly, it would be better to pay less attention to him rather than more, and listen to the government advisers. But free speech is very precious, and if people want to say silly things and look foolish, that will be a matter for them.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Like all colleagues across the House, I'm sure, the bulk of questions from constituents come in after the relevant statement debates, where we have an opportunity to raise those questions, as they have time to percolate on the details, or lack thereof, of what is being proposed and how it will impact them, from breweries to nurseries to self-employed creatives and everything in between. Will he commit to a general debate to raise supplementary questions on these issues to give our constituents the assurances they so desperately need in a very fast-moving situation?
Good idea. Well said.
The Honourable Lady points out a sort of perpetual dilemma of holding to account, that there is always pressure to come to the House in as timely a manner as possible to ensure that the House is informed immediately. On the other hand, there is better information available 24, 48 hours later, which raises more questions. This is why one should view the process of holding to account as a continuum rather than as a one-off occasion, and is why it is important to maintain this House open so that ministers can be held to account. I'm not sure general debates tend to bring that level of focus, but I think question times and continuous statements do, and that will depend on the House being here and sitting.
Deputy Speaker, I welcome the unprecedented level of support provided by the Chancellor to our business earlier this week. But is it not also important to consider our charitable sector during this vital time? Earlier this week, I spoke to the Chief Executive of Suffolk Age UK to ask him how my office could support elderly people within my constituency as much as possible. He said to me that in the short term, lots of volunteers, more volunteers than he's ever had before, but his major concern was the financial future of the charity. In many senses, charities operate in the same way as businesses, and many of their fundraising activities, charity shops, fundraising events have had to be cancelled because of the crisis that we're going through at the moment. Is it not appropriate for the House to set aside time to debate how we can support these vital charities such as Age UK, who through their volunteers are supporting some of the most vulnerable people in our constituencies at the moment?
Mr Deputy Speaker, may I thank the Honourable Gentleman for raising that and for the work that he does to support charities in his constituency, that I think all of us as constituency MPs have a role in our own communities to do what we can to help. I would go back to what the Chancellor has said. He is aware that these difficulties are affecting a range of sectors and that he will do whatever it takes to provide the necessary support. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, is going to be coordinating the volunteering effort so that it is ensured that it is as beneficial as possible.
Brock.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I listened carefully to the Leader of the House's responses to honourable members' points around the many UK citizens stranded abroad, our constituents, and I'm afraid I thought it wouldn't do, Mr Deputy Speaker. So will the government make a statement, written or otherwise, on its plans for repatriating UK citizens home? Or are they supposed to just continue to largely fend for themselves?
Mr Deputy Speaker, one cannot always provide satisfaction, much though I tried hard to do so, but Her Majesty's Government is doing whatever it can to help constituents in these difficult times. The Foreign Secretary is working very hard on this and is working with the airlines on this. That this is a process, and I'm afraid that not everybody is going to be repatriated overnight, because it is not simply a question of doing that. It is a question of getting in touch with people, ensuring that the facilities are available, and then getting them home. But the government is working hard to try and help constituents.
Chris Bryant.
The government undoubtedly needs emergency legislation, but as I understand it, the bill is some 350 pages long. It includes measures which uniquely would allow ministers to switch on and off their powers without any reference to Parliament whatsoever. And the bill is intended to last for 2 years. Now, some of this will be draconian measures restricting the liberty of the individual in this country. They may be completely necessary. But can I just urge the government to think about, first of all, making it possible for us to table amendments on Monday before second reading, which is not the normal way, and secondly, to consider the idea of allowing these measures to last for 90 days before approval by Parliament, and then to be renewed every 30 days thereafter.
That's right.
Mr Speaker, I would look more favourably on the switching on and off mechanism, which, although not previously used, is a means of limiting these powers rather than extending these powers. And I don't think it has been done before, but it ensures that they will only be activated when necessary, and when unneeded will be removed. So I think that is a step in favour of maintaining as much liberty as possible. I recognise it is a long bill. I pay tribute to a Parliamentary Council for their work, which has been really, really remarkable in the short space of time available. It is important that these measures are passed with consensus. He has made his point. I'm sure it will be heard. I haven't forgotten amendments. I believe there's a motion in my name to allow amendments to be put before a second reading, but I can't give him all the comfort he wants on the change of time limit.
Hillier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the House and others have rightly talked about proper scrutiny of what the government is doing, as rather highlighted by my honourable friend, the member for Rhondda. The Leader of the House was slightly disingenuous, I may say, when he talked about the liaison committee being delayed by this House. It was actually a power grab by government to impose a chair from outside its membership that has caused that delay. Nevertheless, it is vital that that committee is up and running, and it could be a hugely useful place for this House, if it had to shrink down in its activities, to question ministers directly and the Prime Minister about actions, especially if we are living under draconian legislation likely to be passed next week. Will the Leader of the House give us some comfort on that issue? And also on the point of the motion on Tuesday relating to the appointments to the Parliamentary Work Sponsor Body, are we actually now finally going to see a group of professionals dealing with the Northern Estate and making sure that in the midst of this crisis, having had flood and pestilence, we don't also see this place burn down under fire as well?
Mr Deputy Speaker, a great deal of work has been done on the fire safety in this building, and measures implemented that will ensure that we are much better protected than we were, and that is very important. People will notice that the Speaker's house the staterooms are currently not usable because fire safety measures are being implemented. So that is taking place. As regards to the Liaison Committee, I think it would be a very novel constitutional development to think that the Liaison Committee could replace the whole House, and I'm not sure that would be something I would welcome.
Jim Shannon.
Before anyone was quarantined for coronavirus, 1 million Uyghur Muslims were in isolated camps run by Chinese government authorities. Now, the combination of limited access to medical resources plus high populations of elderly detainees could lead to a humanitarian disaster if the virus reaches the camps, that may indeed already be there. Would the Leader of the House agree to a statement on this important issue?
I'm always grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his campaigning for religious freedom, irrespective of the religion where he believes there should be freedom, which is wholly admirable. We have consistently expressed our serious concerns, both to China and at the UN, about the human rights situation in Xinjiang, including extrajudicial detention of over 1 million Uyghurs and other minorities in political re-education camps. The Foreign Secretary raised the issue with his Chinese counterpart, State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, on the 9th of March, and we expressed our concerns in the UK's national statement at the UN Human Rights Council earlier this month. So I can assure the Honourable Gentleman that this is being taken very, very seriously by the government.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Leader of the House is responsible for protecting the rights of us members of Parliament as much as being part of the government. And he mentioned earlier on the need for having regular statements here in the House. I remind him that the Health Secretary came to the House under an urgent question on Monday. The Chancellor came here after he'd made his exact same statement to the press, and we had the Education Secretary who came with no plan about closing schools in place after 6 weeks of us being in this crisis. So scrutiny by this House is absolutely crucial. And today, the Cabinet Office is going to publish a list of essential workers who are going to be able to send their children to school. That should be scrutinised by this House. That statement should be made in this House so that we can scrutinise that list. So we need more statements from more departments, not fewer, and the government needs to up its act, because it's clear we've exposed a number of failings in the government through our scrutiny. So it's important that that statement today and that list is published here so that we can scrutinise it.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think the scrutiny has been carried out well by this House, that both the Chancellor and the Secretary of State for Education were questioned for the best part of 2 hours, which is pretty comprehensive scrutiny, with members having the opportunity to raise constituent concerns and points that are valuable to the government to take on board as it considers its policy developments. I'm a great believer in parliamentary scrutiny. I think our adversarial system is a very good way of improving decision making, and therefore I am personally committed to it, and Her Majesty's government is too.
Thank you very
much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Whether it's the production of ventilators or acquiring hotels, there is clearly a role for the private sector to contribute towards this national crisis. I've got a major soap manufacturer in my constituency, Queensleys Soapworks, who are very happy to try and help pitch in as part of this process, but they do need to know in terms of upping that production, which they can do within 24 hours. So can we have a statement from the government about what role is expected from the private sector, particularly in the production of things like hand sanitisers and soap?
That is an extremely helpful question. I will ensure that the company in his constituency is brought to the attention of the relevant ministry to ensure that if more quantities of soap are needed, that his constituency company can be involved in it. The private sector will be crucially involved in this, in cooperating with what the government is doing and with ventilators in changing production to produce ventilators, and I'm sure there is a need to produce other things for which there is greater demand currently. So I'm very grateful for his helpful suggestion.
Kevin Brennan.
Deputy Speaker, like other honourable members, I have constituents stranded overseas. David and Anne Clements, who run a small business in my constituents, are stranded in Quito in Ecuador and were due to fly home tomorrow. But there are no flights and there's no prospect of flights for the immediate future. Could he arrange for the Foreign Secretary to make a further statement, because he seemed to rule out repatriation in previous statements, and perhaps persuade him to attempt more cooperation with other governments, where, if necessary, flights can be arranged for people of different nationalities to be able to bring them safely home?
Yes.
The honourable gentleman makes a helpful point, and the government has done that previously, has cooperated with other nations in repatriation flights. It is a situation that is developing and evolving, and the ability to bring people home has become harder in recent days. But as I said earlier, the Foreign Secretary is working very hard on this and is in discussion with the airlines.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to add my voice to all of those MPs who have called for an urgent statement on what the government is doing to repatriate UK nationals. I have one constituent who is in a party of 5 in a military hospital in Hanoi in Vietnam. They are staying in filthy conditions, surrounded by cockroaches and dead rats, and despite writing to the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs on Tuesday, I have had no reply. I have three constituents, stuck in Peru, and they haven't been told to buy a private ticket, but they've been told, in fact, to stay where they are and not even to attempt to get to an airport. So we do need to know from a minister in this House when and how our constituents can get home.
Mr Deputy Speaker, dare I say it isn't as easy as that, because there are different problems in different countries, and therefore simply to say when people can get home is not within the gift of the government, and there are different practices being followed in different countries. However, I note that the Honourable Lady has not received a reply to a particular inquiry, and I will ensure that that is taken up so that a reply is brought to her in a reasonable amount of time.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank the Leader of the House for his comments in stressing how important it is that members here are well informed. But I think to the outside world, it does seem like the business of the House is business as usual. Can I suggest, and echoing the points perhaps made by my friend, the member for Elton, that we need more frequent updates, statements if you want to call them, by the different departments, which are many that are being impacted by this crisis. And not only that, that we actually have daily reporting from the Health Secretary to explain the number of cases, the number of testing, the number of deaths, and the amount of equipment that we are getting out to our much-needed hospitals. Only then can we inform our constituents of how this crisis is impacting on our communities.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the House has adjusted its programme to allow members to be updated at unusual times. Statements have been coming on thanks to Mr Speaker's flexibility at times when other business was taking place, and the opposition graciously allowed its own opposition day to be interrupted yesterday at an early time to allow a statement to be made. So I think our procedures are being adapted, and as I look around the chamber, I notice that social distancing is being pretty well practiced, with broadly the only exception being my opposite number, the Right Honourable Lady. But other than that, and a couple of government ministers too. So I think we are trying to get the balance right and understand the government's message What is the government's message? The government's message is that social distancing is advised for all of us and strongly advised for those over 70 or with certain serious medical conditions. But the government has not said that businesses should not carry on. And our business carries on in this chamber, and that is in line with government advice. There is no contradiction between social distancing and continuing with business, as the other half of his question points towards, because honourable and right honourable members want to hold the government to account, and that means we need to be here to do that. But there again, a balance needs to be struck. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, has come to the House often to update the House. But my right honourable friend also has considerable ministerial responsibilities, particularly heavy ones at the moment. And I think the House ought to be reasonable in what it asks of him, because if he were to be here every day for 2 or 3 hours, that would be 2 or 3 hours when he were not able to be attending to his ministerial business. And I think it is getting that balance right that is important, and where in terms of my own role, I recognise that I must look at it from both directions, both from the point of view of the House and the House being informed and holding to account, but also from the point of view of what it is reasonable to ask of ministers.
Many thanks, Mr Deputy Speaker. I wonder if I might, in the first instance, give the Leader of the House an opportunity to clarify his answer to my honourable friend, the member for Edinburgh North and Leith, when we talked about repatriating citizens back to the UK. The Leader of the House said that the government would do whatever it can, and I'm slightly concerned that this contrasts with the Prime Minister's rhetoric, which is we'll do whatever it takes. And I think we should be looking to do whatever it takes to get our people back home to this country. In addition to that, we heard a litany of challenges that face small businesses and large businesses in our constituencies this morning during the urgent question. And businesses in my constituency of Angus in Arbroath are facing very challenging situations getting their broker and their insurers, and crucially the reinsurers, to come to face up straightforwardly to what the obligations are under business continuity claims. Can we have a statement which sets out what the government's expectations are on the insurance industry, and that that's been done in tandem with the Association of British Insurers?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I would reiterate that the government, and particularly the Foreign Secretary, is working very hard on the repatriation issue. But may I add that I will report to him after this session the widespread concern of so many members. It is not one of those things that has just come up from one member with a particular case. It seems to be, and I notice nodding and even hands going up, of concern across the House. So I will pass that on in an underlined fashion. There are indeed a litany of challenges faced by businesses. That's why my honourable friend was here for an urgent question earlier. And I understand the point that is being made about insurers. It is difficult for the government to make a single statement on what will be a variety of contractual obligations, but insurers have already, thanks to the intervention actually of my honourable friend who answered the urgent question, the member for Salisbury, they have already behaved well in relation to businesses that have not been formally told to close but have de facto had to close, and that was a helpful announcement made by the Chancellor a couple of days ago. So the insurance industry, though much criticised, is in some cases already behaving well.
Point of order. Point of order, Mr. David Davis. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In his response to my honourable friend for Windsor, the Leader of the House answered, in effect, that the Civil Contingencies Act was not available for this particular emergency. Now, I'm quite sure, that, knowing my right honourable friend, that he was repeating with absolute good faith the briefing he'd been given. However, I was here and lived through, as it were, the passage of that Act, and it's not my understanding of it. More importantly, perhaps, it's not the understanding of a number of public lawyers about that Act. So could you undertake to get Speaker's Counsel to give this House an opinion as to whether the Civil Contingencies Act is applicable before we move the emergency legislation next week?
Further to that point of order, Chris Bryant. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Further to that point of order, one of the key aspects of the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 is that renewal of powers has to happen within, or the use of powers has to be approved by Parliament within 7 days, and the powers can only last for 30 days before they have to be renewed by Parliament. And indeed, there's specific measures to make sure that the House of Commons is sitting if we're in a recess, or even if we're prorogued. So I wonder whether you could feed that into the process of answering to the honourable member.
It does seem to be both points of order are supplementary business questions, but the Leader of the House is still in his place, will have heard both points of order, and I'm sure that the Treasury bench will reflect on what the honourable members have said today. Point of order, Mr Mark Pritchard.
Mr Deputy Speaker, you all know that Mr Speaker prides himself on standing up for the rights of backbenchers, and backbenchers need to, perhaps more than ever, stand up for the rights of their constituents. And given that the House is due to rise on the 21st, and yet the Leader of the House spoke about potential flexibility with that, and I understand why he said that, can you give an assurance to my constituents, especially as the government is seeking unprecedented powers, possibly without review, or review in the future, maybe months in the future, that this House sits for as long as it can in order that the government is held to account?
To what the Leader of the House had to say during responses to questions, and it seems to me that the commitment from the government was exactly what the honourable member is seeking. Point of order, Kevin Brennan.
Deputy Speaker, during business questions, the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee mentioned a motion that the Leader brought forward this week in relation to select committees, which created a new post outside of normal standing orders of Chair of the Liaison Committee, and put a named individual in the motion to take that post, which flies in the face of the normal practice adopted in this House for many years. The chairs of select committees should be elected from amongst the whole House, with all members of the House having an opportunity to put their name forward, albeit on a party-balanced basis for those particular positions. I wonder if you could adjudicate, Mr Deputy Speaker, whether it would be possible for the Leader to bring forward an amended motion, leaving that part of the motion out, allowing the liaison committee and all select committees to be set up forthwith.
The Speaker being very keen to ensure the rights of backbenchers are properly respected, and therefore I will make absolutely certain that the comments are passed on to the Speaker when I vacate the chair.
Presentation of Bill, Secretary Elizabeth Truss.
Trade Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Presentation of Bill, Secretary Priti Patel.
Fire Safety Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Presentation of Bill, Secretary Matt Hancock.
Coronavirus Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. I remind the House that members may now table amendments to the coronavirus bill. I encourage, Chris Bryan's already going, I encourage honourable members who want to table amendments to do so by sending them to the Public Bill Office by email from their Parliamentary Network account. If members would like advice on amendments, could I encourage them to phone the Public Bill Office rather than visit in person? We now come to the backbench motion on the government response to the Sir Amias point of order.
I'm sorry to have delayed my point of order, but it is pertinent, particularly to this business. Can I ask why the Financial Secretary's excellent biography of Adam Smith has not been laid on the table as one of the papers pertinent to this debate? You will appreciate that Adam Smith was absolutely categoric in his view of taxation, that it should be fair, proportionate, not retrospective, and not arbitrary, which is clearly the subject matter of this afternoon's debate.
It's as if he read my mind. I'm sure that the Treasury bench will have heard his comments. We now come to the backbench motion on the government response to the Sir Amias Morse review of the Loan Charge 2019. Mr David Davis to move.
I stand to move the motion in the name of Ruth Cadbury, Dr Julian Lewis and myself, and supported by some 40 other members of this House. And I start with commending my right honourable friend for having the cunning to beat me to the punch in this particular debate. It may seem strange to outside observers that in the midst of a global pandemic and a huge national crisis that we are talking about a tax technicality, or at least that is how it might appear. But actually, it's one of the great virtues of our country that no matter what the crisis, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's warfare, this House always pays attention to issues of natural justice. And we never ignore issues of natural justice, even in times of crisis. And as a matter of justice, which this is not a party political issue. In politics, in our business, justice is a matter of honour. Honour that we deliver to the British people, and that's what we intend to do today. And this is an injustice with very large consequences. We have all met and listened to constituents who are facing utter financial ruin as a result of this policy. It is ruining people's lives. There have been at least 7 suicides caused by the stress, the anxiety and the financial hardship of this policy. And here is to give the House the flavour of this, because it doesn't just apply to those who commit suicide, but those who are under the stress. Here is what the family of one loan charge victim told the all-party group about his suicide note. Quote, "He wrote about being at the end of his tether with a loan charge. He wrote such awful things about himself, things that just weren't true, that he clearly thought about himself at the time. He wrote he did not set out to do such wrongdoings. He wrote about being unable to speak to his GP about his anxiety as he was ashamed, his fear of going to prison, his disgust at himself for getting mixed up in the loan charge, and his belief that he would now go to hell." In the case of this individual, the loan charge policy did not just take his money, it took his self-respect and eventually his life. And there could be more. According to the loan charge all-party group, 39% of those affected have had suicidal thoughts. I think the Minister will be hard pushed to think of another government policy that's caused more than a third of those affected to consider suicide. But it's no surprise it's having that effect on people. 68% have suffered depression, 71% faced bankruptcy, 49% could lose their homes. And I've said in the previous debate on this issue that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and that's never been more clearly demonstrated than here. I will give way.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way and congratulating him on winning this debate. On the all-party parliamentary group, we took evidence from a number of family members of people who had committed suicide as a result of the loan charge. And can I underline the point he is making? The impact on people who had been law-abiding, hard-working throughout their lives has been quite traumatic. And in some cases, a particular case that I remember, I'm sure my honourable friend from Brentford and Isleworth will remember, the person who took his own life did not owe a huge amount of money. It was the fact that he had been made to feel like a criminal when he was anything but.
The right honourable gentleman makes an extraordinarily powerful point in his own skillful way. And I say but this back to him. His committee took this evidence before the added economic stress of the coronavirus. Because many of these individuals will be contractors. There'll be people who maybe have no rights at the moment and certainly no way of finding the money to meet the demands upon them. So even small sums of money will bring enormous pressure to bear on the individual. So he's right, this is not some vague and abstract tax issue. This is about people's lives. And that's why I was pleased when the government launched the Amias Morse review into the policy. And in December, Sir Amias Morse published a detailed report, and I commend him, frankly, for his heroic attempt to find a compromise, because that's really what he did. The facts and the conclusions are a little different, and the reason is he was trying to find a compromise. But I'm afraid when it comes to matters of natural justice, a compromise is nowhere near enough. Such a detailed review deserves detailed scrutiny, and within the limits of the time, I'm going to spend a small amount of time looking at his central findings. Now, Sir Amias recommended a December 2010 cut-off date for the loan charge. All loans before that date will be out of the loan charge scope. Now, in a piece for the House magazine some time ago, I referred to that as arbitrary, and Sir Amias responded. He said, it's not an arbitrary date, it's the date from which the Finance Act 2011 ensured a tax was charged on income paid through loan schemes. Well, that simply didn't make sense even in its own terms. The Finance Act was not law in December 2010, it was simply draft legislation. It was not passed for another 8 months until July 2011. Now, HMRC does not, or certainly should not, take its instruction from draft legislation. It certainly should not take it from press releases, which was what actually went out on that day. It takes its instruction from settled law. And both of those words matter. Settled law. Sir Amias went on to argue in his House magazine piece that once the 2011 Act was passed, tax should have been understood as being due from that point. But even in 2011, the law was far from clear, after the government suffered a series of defeats in the courts.
My right honourable friend give way on that point.
I will give way, yes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My constituents just don't have any extra money. They've used it all up each year. And frankly, after 2010, they were continually told by financial experts and the companies they were contracted to that all was well, carry on. So suddenly, in 2017, they're faced with a massive bill and they just can't cope.
And what I'm talking about now is how we got that position. He's exactly right. Now I'll talk again about the financial status of the people we're talking about today. But and he's right. They aren't rich people. Again, I'll come back to. But HMRC, who have claimed that this is clear law, lost the case in Dexter and Sempra cases in 2002 and 2008, respectively, when the court specifically rejected the idea that the loans could be subject to income tax. HMRC then lost a case first in 2012 and then again in 2014, demonstrating that the 2011 legislation had not clarified the law to the satisfaction of the courts. And that's a key point, not to our satisfaction, not to our constituents, to the satisfaction of the courts. Now, the fact that HMRC lost twice and then won twice tells us that even experienced, highly informed judges spending a great deal of time studying these cases found it a difficult issue to resolve. I will allow him on that point.
Isn't the proof of the pudding in the fact that the 2017 legislation was introduced? The loan charge itself is a standing proof that previous legislation was not sufficient to tax these people. Otherwise, they'd have done it.
As usual, my right honourable friend trumps my argument in advance, but I will come back to it in a second. You see, what that demonstrates, and his point demonstrates too, is the failure of the Treasury and HMRC to write clear and comprehensible legislation. So, if the judges can't understand it, what chance ordinary laymen, people who cannot afford to employ an accountant? And we're not talking about city slickers here or international bankers. We're talking about locum nurses, social workers, care workers and hospital cleaners. I give way on the
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman and his point that these are not just all city slickers, tax avoiding, money grabbing sorts. Reminds me of my constituent, Caroline Cheesty. She was a social worker in the public sector, 24 years experience with local authorities, had a career break, then when she wanted to go back as a locum, was advised either you form a PLC or you go with an umbrella company. That's what she did. She came to my surgery in tears. Does he not agree with me that the government should go after the promoters of these schemes, not the little people?
Here. She's tempting me into a political point because the Blair government was the most active promoter of these things, but she's right in general. The point is right in general. Now, 1 second. I'll make 2 paragraphs progress, and I'll give the my honourable friend his intervention. Now, when something is as unclear as this tax law obviously was, you don't take the date of resolution from the first date that HMRC wins. You don't say, we keep going until they get the answer the government wants. You take it from the day it's resolved finally in the Supreme Court. And the case was not finally and definitively settled by the Supreme Court until 2017, where it found in HMRC's favour on Rangers and Dextra and the Sempra cases. Now, the government, again, and this is my right honourable friend's point, then passed further legislation to clarify the law. Even after the court case, they then passed the legislation to clarify the law. So if it was so clear, his point, why do we need a new law in 2017? That's the fundamental centre of this. I give way to my honourable friend.
My right honourable friend is making an unanswerable case in logic, but I would just like to make another political point and put it to him, and that is the cause of tax avoidance is not normally associated with such parties as the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrat Party, but I'm sure he would acknowledge that honourable and right honourable members from both those parties have played a leading role in trying to put this injustice right.
He is absolutely right. I started by saying this was not a political issue, it was an issue of honour, and as you would expect from our House, one of the greatest parliaments in the world, if not the greatest, all sides take part in defending that honour. And on that point, I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
In giving way, the intervention was spot on. This has brought the House together, because the issue isn't about tax avoidance. I think everyone on all sides disagrees that tax avoidance should be clamped down on, and there's no disagreement that the loan charge could apply in the future. What has concerned many of us very deeply is that this is offence against the rule of law, which is supposed to be a basic British tradition, one of our core values taught in our schools. And so I do totally agree with the points made by the right honourable gentleman.
I nearly called him my right honourable friend from my days in the Public Accounts Committee, but the right honourable gentleman. So, when financial advisors and accountants could not understand the law, when employers could not understand the law, when the courts could not agree on the law until 2017, how could an ordinary layperson possibly have understood the law? Now, the Supreme Court's eventual decision overturning 3 decisions before reflects changing national attitudes on the responsibility of the taxpayer. The point that the right honourable gentleman has just spoken really lights one. One second, I'll just finish the paragraph and then I will, of course, give way. As a result, one professional organisation, one organisation representing the professions involved here, explicitly changed its own guidance to its members. And what it said was, members must not create, encourage or promote tax planning arrangements or structures that set out to achieve results that are contrary to the clear intention of Parliament in enacting relevant legislation and or are highly artificial or highly contrived and seek to exploit shortcomings within the relevant legislation. In what year was that changed guidance handed out by the professions? 2017. I give way to mine.
I'm very grateful. He's making some very good points, which I agree with. But does he not agree that if something looks too good to be true, it usually is? In my business, we have been brought these kind of schemes over the last 30 years a number of times by our advisors, maybe with a barrister's letter to say, don't worry, it'll all be fine, but you can reduce your tax bill hugely by adopting this scheme. We always rejected them because we knew the risk was there. There is a requirement, does he not agree? There's a requirement on the individual who subscribes to one of these schemes to make sure they understand the risks, and there is no guarantee that these schemes will actually ultimately reduce their tax burden.
Firstly, I'd say to my honourable friend that, of course, he is a skilled businessman and he knows what he's doing and he's across this, and it's his job to be across this sort of thing. If you can say that about a locum nurse or a social worker, I am not so sure. But this was actually at core, the centre of Sir Amias Morse's arguments, which I will come to, I think, immediately. Actually, I may as well. Sir Amias took the view that the attitude from 2017 should apply right back to 1990, back to 2010, even though the law in effect not being clear. And what he said was, I take the view that the principle of a taxpayer's responsibility for their own tax affairs must be upheld. That's the point, I think, that my honourable friend is making precisely. Well, that's true. That's true. But only when the law is clear. Only when the law is clear. Which means the government itself has a responsibility. It has a responsibility to make the law clear and not to punish ordinary, hard-working taxpayers when it fails to live up to that responsibility. And HMRC themselves seem to disagree on the importance of the taxpayer's own responsibility. Why do I say that? Because until 2014, HMRC didn't approach the individual taxpayers. They approached the advisors. They approached the companies that insisted, and I note, insisted, didn't ask, insisted with their locums and their social work, insisted that they took up this option. That's what HMRC did. They went to the advisors until 2014, until this suddenly started to become quite controversial. And last year, the Prime Minister himself commented on this. He said, the real culprits in this matter, if I may say so, are perhaps not so much the individuals themselves who've decided to use the loan charge as a way of minimising the tax exposure. It's the people who advised them that it was a sensible thing to do. In my view, we should find a way of going after them. That's the Prime Minister's view. And I happen to agree, unusually. Would you forgive me? I really do. I've tried to constrain this to 15 minutes, and it's beginning to be a struggle with so many conventions, so if you'll forgive me. So in summary, these people are now suffering because of a history of poorly drafted regulation and legislation and poor management by HMRC targeted on the wrong people. Now, on many occasions, the Minister and his predecessor have told me and this House that the loan charge is not retrospective. In his report, Sir Amias Morse says the loan charge can look back 20 years. This design has been described by the Treasury as retroactive. The report describes the loan charge throughout as backward-looking. HMRC have denied it's retrospective. They said it's retroactive. Well, if I may say so, that's a distinction without a difference. When I looked up retrospective in the thesaurus, guess what it said? It defined the word as retroactive or backward-looking. So, not only that.
Maybe the thesaurus wasn't clear.
Yes, I'll send HMRC a copy of Microsoft's thesaurus. But not only that. In paragraph 3.8 of his report, Sir Amias says, the review's legal advisors found that there was no precedent for that element of the design. That's the retroactive or retrospective or looking back. There was no legal precedent for this design. So I hope the government, frankly, will now stop playing with words and finally concede that this is indeed a retrospective measure, an unprecedented retrospective measure. And so the only just, fair and rational resolution is to remove the retrospective nature of the loan charge and set the cut-off date when the law became clear. When the Supreme Court finally settled the matter in 2017 and when the government felt it necessary to legislate to make it clear what it meant in the first place. That's why, and as I made clear before, if the government does not act to address this, Parliament, all of us who take this very seriously, will have to act for it and make clear that in future HMRC can under no circumstances act retrospectively. So here comes a finance bill if we can't solve this. Now, I would suggest one very simple adjustment to his plans before they are published, to change December 2010 to July 2017. That would resolve the issue. It would lift enormous pressure off our constituents, 50,000 of them, and it will put the government in a morally defensible, justifiable and decent position. Tax law is the only part of English law where innocent until proven guilty does not apply. If the HMRC tell you you owe money, then until you prove otherwise, you owe the money. So it's very, very important that the law is clear, that it's not subject to reinterpretation by subsequent governments, and it doesn't move with social mores or whatever. It is simply clear, and that's what we have to do. So in the interest of natural justice and the interest of the financial and mental well-being of thousands of our constituents, it's time for the government to change its mind and remove this harrowing burden from the 50,000 people who've been caught by it.
The question is, as on the order paper. Chris Matheson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I intend only to speak for a couple of minutes on this matter, partly because of the outstanding introduction from the Right Honourable Gentleman for Halton Brighton Howden, which was clear, logical and unimpeachable, and I congratulate him on this debate. But partly I only need to make a short contribution because the situation is simple. It's quite a clear situation that we face. I'm clear about two facts. First of all, these loan schemes, DR schemes as they're known, were clearly a tax dodge and were used for people to pay less tax. And it is absolutely right, as the Right Honourable Gentleman for Kingston and Surbiton hinted in his intervention, that we close down those loopholes. But it is also clear that these are put in place unfairly, unjustly, as a retrospective measure. And what's the proof of that particular pudding? Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman for New Forest West beat us all to it, but he's absolutely right. Why on earth did we need to introduce the 2017 legislation to introduce the 2019 loan charge if, as the government claims and HMRC claims, these schemes were already illegal? They weren't. That's why the loan charge was brought in, and it is utterly wrong to bring in retrospective legislation and retrospective taxation as a result. It is entirely within the rights of HMRC to look at people's previous tax records up to a period of 5 years, but that's only if the information that the individual has given to HMRC can be proved to be incorrect. But we're talking here about individuals who've had their correct tax returns signed off by HMRC, and HMRC themselves have agreed that these are perfectly legitimate and lawful within the current tax law, and then they've been reopened not because there is a suggestion that the individuals have provided incorrect information, but because the law is actually changed or wasn't quite as HMRC themselves thought it was at the time that they signed off those tax regulations. That's HMRC's problem. It's not the problem of my constituents. And I've had constituents, fortunately I don't know of any constituents who had to take their own life, but I've had constituents who have lost their business, I've had constituents who've lost their house, one constituent whose marriage has broken up, one who was a young lad up doing his first job, a contracting job, and he was told on the first day, this is the way that we get paid in this place. He didn't know any better. 21 years old, just out of university, and that was the way that he was encouraged by the employer and incidentally by his colleagues to undertake this, this scheme. He doesn't yet know what his liability will be. Will it be £16,000? Will it be £60,000? And the uncertainty is dragging him down, that at the moment he doesn't feel able even to work. So I congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman from Halton Brighton Howden. I echo the Right Honourable Gentleman from Kingston and Surbiton who says that this is not actually a party issue. Honourable members will all agree this is a question of natural justice, of fairness, of not reopening tax returns that had previously been signed off by HMRC. Let's close the loophole by all means, but let's not drag people into this dreadful sense of natural injustice.
There's 13 other people who want to get in fact more than that now. So I would plead for contributions of the length that we've just seen from Chris Matheson. Very short, please. Otherwise, we're simply not going to do justice to the next debate. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Business questions just before this debate. I asked about the perennial issue of war widows whose pensions were stopped because they remarried or cohabited. And we were told in no uncertain terms that these would not be reinstated retrospectively. On 6th of February, I put down a question to the Minister on the bench today, asking about the apparent difference in the approach between the between the approach to war widows not getting retrospective pensions, but people being hit retroactively by the loan charge. I was told in the reply that the loan charge is not retrospective. We now know the reason it's not retrospective, because it's retroactive, even if the two things are exactly the same. I pay tribute to my right honourable friend for Halton, Price and Howden for taking the initiative, as he has done over months, to try and put this right, and also to the all-party parliamentary group led so ably by the right honourable member for Kingston and Surbiton and our former colleague Greg Mulholland, who has done a great deal of background research in support. My understanding of the situation can be summarised as follows. First, uncertainties arising from the IR35 legislation led tax experts to approve these umbrella company loan schemes. Second, many self-employed public sector workers, amongst others, had no idea that they were even being paid by means of these loans. Thirdly, if HMRC had been doing its job properly, it would have been sanctioning the purveyors of these schemes and warning the victims straight away as soon as they sent in their first annual returns that they were making themselves liable for charges. Fourthly, and this is quite incredible, these schemes are still being sold to thousands of people who clearly still have no idea what is waiting for them from HMRC further down the line. Fifth, even the Morse Review's decision to exempt people affected by this prior to 2010 leaves those who were bullied into making large payments relating to the years before 2010 unable now to get those settlements rescinded. So people actually paid up money before the Morse Review for a period now that has been exempted, and where they could probably negotiate better settlements, if any settlements were still needed, than those for which they have paid money that they cannot now get back because they cannot reopen the negotiation. 6, people acted in good faith on the best professional advice that they could get. They should not have been left in blissful ignorance for years on end by a government body that is now playing catch-up. Because of the constraints on time, I will not go through the harrowing personal testimonies. I will just stick to a couple more theoretical points and then I shall conclude. So seventh, it has been pointed out that there was something called Part 7A ITEPA, which came into effect in December 2010, and this has been cited as justifying the decision for the loan charge to apply from 2010 onwards. But I am advised by Alan Williams FCA, a constituent as well as a highly qualified professional, that this does not apply to the self-employed. So the self-employed, who are so often victims of this setup, ought not to be caught by a provision, by the assumed knowledge of a provision that didn't apply to them in any case. An eighth point is that the loan charge is not in any case full and final settlement, and therefore doesn't close open years. Even those paying the loan charge will see HMRC continuing to pursue further sums for so-called protected years in which loans were received. And the recommendation of Mr. Williams is that those accepting the loan charge should be afforded finality by making the loan charge full and final settlement. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I come to the conclusion that HMRC fell down on the job. They were asleep at the wheel. They bullied the victims and they let the villains who created these schemes get away with it. So HMRC in this case are not just bullies, they are negligent bullies. And the government should know when it's beaten, both morally and intellectually, stop flogging this dead horse and finally do the right thing.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for New Forest East, and I'm delighted to say on this occasion I agree with every word he says. And I think that is the nature of this debate, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's brought all sides together, people who aren't necessarily normally in total agreement on economic and tax affairs. It has brought us together for the reason that the right honourable gentleman member for Halton Price and Howden said. It's about natural justice. Mr Deputy Speaker, having set up the loan charge APPG last year, I think it has just become a group that illustrates the way the House has come together. We now have 227 members. We are co-chaired by my honourable friend, the member for Brentford and Isleworth, and our honourable friend, the member for Hemel Hempstead. I should say he wanted to be here today, but he has a family issue which kept him away. So not only do we represent, Mr Deputy Speaker, colleagues from across the House, I believe we've gone about our business in a pretty professional way with the support of the Loan Charge Action Group as our Secretariat. We produced reports in the past, Mr Deputy Speaker, and as a group we have reviewed the Morse Review itself, and we have published our response to the Morse Review. That follows two witness sessions where we had tax experts, we had loan charge victims, we received more written evidence, and we built on our previous work. And this 63-page report published today has 17 key findings on the Morse Review and makes 19 recommendations. I've been on a number of APPGs over my time in this House, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm sure you have. It's relatively unusual for an APPG to do such a thorough and detailed report in such short time. If I only have one disagreement with the right honourable gentleman member for Halton Price and Howden, I wish he'd given us a little bit more time to do our work before this debate. I'm really pleased we've got this debate. And I hope the Minister, whatever he says from the dispatch box in response to this debate, will undertake to read the APPG's report and respond to it. When the Morse Review was set up, we welcomed it. It is what we had been seeking, and we had meetings with Zemias, and we gave him a huge amount of material. And it's fair to say, and to put on record on behalf of the APPG, that we welcome many aspects of his report. He talks about how unusual the loan charge is and how, frankly, unique it is, how it overrides statutory time limits which are meant to protect the individual taxpayer. That it looks back over 20 years. What an astonishing piece of legislation to put forward. It has a number of good recommendations. For example, it says that if the loan charge continues, after 10 years of repaying, any remaining liability should be written off if the taxpayer has earnings of less than $30,000. One would have thought that was a reasonable recommendation, Mr Speaker, even if the government wants to stand by the loan charge, but they have rejected it. The government have rejected even that relatively modest recommendation. I would have thought Her Majesty's Treasury would and HMRC would have agreed with all the recommendations in the spirit of the Morse Review, but they haven't. Some they've rejected in full, some in part, and some they are interpreting in a way which is clearly not intended by the Morse Review. For example, Mr Speaker, one of the group of taxpayers I've been most worried about is those who've had closed tax years. In other words, their tax affairs properly given to HMRC with all the relevant material and backup had been accepted and that tax year had been closed. Now, there can be no doubt that going back to such a year is complete and utter retrospection. Yet, the government are still seeking to apply the loan charge to those years, and they have narrowed in a most outrageous way the way we consider the concept of a closed tax year. So I'm really unhappy with the way the government has responded to the Morse Review itself. But the Morse Review does have a big flaw at its heart, which the right honourable gentleman for Halton, Price and Howden set out in detail, and because he did, I won't need to speak for so long, Mr Deputy Speaker. Essentially, what Morse says is that the law that was passed in 2011, the Income Tax Brackets Earnings and Pensions Act, and particularly Part 7A, made it clear. Now, the right honourable gentleman showed that it didn't make it clear, even for those people directly linked to it because of the timings that he set out. But actually, in specific detail, the expert witnesses that we saw in the APPG made very clear that that legislation only covered some of the schemes that the loan charge applies to. Those schemes that involved employees who were being paid via a third party. But that legislation completely omitted entire existing schemes that involve the self-employed, that involve companies, that involve loans paid directly to employees. So there can be no doubt that that legislation that Morse was relying on does not apply to many people because they're just not covered by that legislation. It's not a question of debate, it's just a fact. And experts at the time looked at the legislation and responded in the way that you would. They looked at what the legislation said and changed their advice accordingly. And indeed, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs advice was based on what was actually in the Act, surprisingly enough. There's a 2016 technical note, which our report refers to, where HMRC specifically says that is what the legislation said. Now, I find it quite extraordinary that ministers, successive ministers, have tried to defend this, this double talk from HMRC. And as the right honourable gentleman who opened the debate said, no court rulings in any way interpreted the legislation in the way that the Morse Review does. So while I have a huge amount of respect for Sir Amos Morse, I think on this point he is entirely wrong. And I've not seen, and I don't read all the tax literature, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the tax experts that have contacted us are really clear that Morse is getting the legislation, as it was understood at the time, completely wrong. Happy to give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way to me. Could I ask him, when he took evidence, when the right honourable gentleman took evidence, and took evidence from people who are subject to the loan charge, did he receive any evidence to the effect that their chartered accountants or their financial analysts since 2010 had told the people who they were being paid by that they were in real danger and they'd better actually change the way they pay their taxes?
For that intervention, we took no such evidence. No such evidence was proffered to us. It may exist out there, but we've certainly not seen that. Madam Speaker, I don't want to detain the House any longer. I've made my core point, but I want to just summarise the whole reason why this has been such a big issue and why it's united the House. And that is that this is retrospective legislation. And it is unfair, and it is wrong. And we have to defend individual taxpayers, even if we think they might have been ill-advised to do it in the first place. We have to defend the law. And why do we meet in this House? Why do we pass laws unless we come back and say, government, you're breaking the law, and hold them to account for that? That is our constitutional job, and I want to thank right honourable members from across the House for doing their duty.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I too congratulate my right honourable friend for Horton, Price and Howden and the Backbench Committee for securing this and others, this very important debate. It may not be the most pressing issue that we are facing at the moment, but it does address the deeply held concerns of constituents caught up in this injustice. And I say injustice because I truly believe that that's what it is, an injustice. Now, this debate is to look at the Morse Review, which I believe did have some welcome outcomes, but I don't believe for 1 minute it went far enough. Now, I believe, can I say at the start, I believe everyone has a duty and an obligation to pay their fair share of tax, and that anyone who evades tax should be rightly sought out and made to pay.
But that isn't what we are dealing with here. Here we're dealing with, in many cases, ordinary people who were either forced or persuaded into schemes that they were advised were perfectly legitimate and approved by HMRC. And there lies the problem. And by way of example, I would like to share with the House an account of one particular constituent who is caught up in this and is facing a bill for tens of thousands of pounds and potential financial ruin. Now, I know that the government and HMRC have said that that will not be the outcome, but I assure you, looking at the details of his case, it would be. So my constituent is an intelligent individual, but by no means a tax expert. So when he gave up his job in 2011, deciding to work freelance so that he could get a better work-life balance, he was advised to join a freelancer scheme, a scheme established and promoted by an ICAEW-regulated chartered accountant. The promotional literature unambiguously stated that the accountant scheme was anodyne with no tax avoidance motive, HMRC words involved, legal and compliant, and supported by tax counsel's opinion. However, at no point did the chartered accountant mention any known or future possible risks, either verbally or in writing. Simply, the chartered accountant positioned my constituent's use of the scheme through which he would receive a combination of salary and loans, as he was told this was perfectly legal and an effective tax planning tool. That said, in mid-2012, having noted some adverse media coverage of the subject of tax avoidance, my constituents sought confirmation from the promoter that the scheme remained truly anodyne, as had been stated when he joined it. The promoter's response was unequivocal. Nothing has changed. Later in 2012, a copy of an HMRC letter addressed to the promoter and dated the 20th of June 2012 was forwarded to my constituent in validation of the chartered accountant's previous assurances that the scheme was legitimate. The letter confirmed that for the purposes of mandatory disclosure under DOTAS legislation, HMRC's anti-avoidance group had formally reviewed the scheme and determined it could apply no hallmarks of tax avoidance. Therefore, of critical significance, HMRC stated the scheme was not disclosable. The unambiguous content of HMRC's letter gave my constituent absolutely no reason to consider its anti-avoidance group had undertaken anything other than a full, diligent review into the scheme, and with the absence of any adverse findings, meaning he could continue to use this scheme safely. But even then, as a cautious person, my constituent sought further confirmation from the promoter and was again reassured. Why would he not carry on using a scheme when he has sought so many reassurances? And I wish to restate that if HMRC had even the slightest concerns as to the legitimacy of the scheme and or my constituents' use of it, then its failure to openly communicate such concerns denied my constituent the clear and obvious opportunity to immediately depart the scheme in mid-2012. As it is, in late 2013, HMRC notified my constituent that it had opened a formal Section 9A inquiry into his use of the scheme, at which point he immediately ceased to use it. Regardless, to this day, more than 6 years after the launching of that Section 9A inquiry into my constituent's use of the scheme, the inquiry has remained open and he has yet to receive any technical argument from HMRC as to why it considers the scheme was unlawful. It is very clear to me that HMRC and the loan charge, or see the loan charge as a panacea for its historic and obvious failures. It's attempting to bypass my constituents' basic right as a taxpayer to have a court rule on any disputed alleged additional liability. We've heard from countless honourable and right honourable members and from esteemed independent tax practitioners that HMRC must, at the very least, be forced to desist using the loan charge to drive through this retrospective, unproven and ordinarily out-of-time claims that predate enactment of the Finance Act 2017. I strongly agree with that viewpoint and feel that it would be undeniably fair and entirely unreasonable to pursue people before that date. Therefore, in light of the uncertainties caused by the current situation with the coronavirus and the effect it is having on freelancers' ability to work and earn at this time, can I please ask that existing legislation be amended such that the loan charge is made prospective from 2017 onwards and remove at least one level of uncertainty for this important group of people at this very difficult time. Thank you.
Colleagues will see that there are a number of honourable and right honourable members wanting to speak in this debate and the debate afterwards. If we are to be able to get everybody in fairly, I would ask that speeches are 5 minutes. Neil Hart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's indisputable that everyone should pay their fair share of tax to fund our public services, and if recent events have taught us anything, it has illustrated that we all rely on the response of those services, and any future threat of funding must be resisted. However, the Government's current position on this issue is frankly quite wrong and unjust. At 35 billion, the Government's official estimate of tax losses is now the highest it's ever been, yet the true figure of tax avoidance by the super-rich and corporations could be as high as 120 billion a year. My constituent, Doug Aitken, is facing a significant bill as a result of loan charge. This is money he simply hasn't got, and if HMRC persists, he will lose his home, his car, and being self-employed, the resulting bankruptcy will result in the loss of his business and his personal contribution to the Exchequer. Like many, he took independent advice from tax experts before entering the scheme and was reassured that it was operating within the law. He declared his income and submitted his tax returns. He set money aside ready to pay any tax liabilities, and he kept that money for the HMRC look-back period. He is not alone. I have a number of other constituents who've contacted me regarding this matter. Some are retired or are now surviving on benefits. They simply do not have the resources to pay. Others have spoken of the significant impact on their mental health. Whilst the changes to the look-back period from the Morse report may exempt thousands from being pursued, thousands more are still facing the prospect of absolute financial ruin. This is nothing short of a disgrace. Meaningful recovery is very unlikely, whereas bankruptcy is almost certain. In closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to offer my reflections on the key argument put forward by Sir Amos in favour of recovery. In his recent contribution to the House magazine, he explained that the advice he took about the legality was from tax experts. However, he also notes that the contributions from those who entered the schemes evidence that they did not understand the implications, i.e. they are not tax experts. And whilst Sir Amos may have sympathy with the loan charge recipients, pursuing them now is very unlikely to lead to any meaningful recovery. Having previously served the Health Service Ombudsman as a clinical expert, I was advised that I should not assess the treatment and care provided against my gold standard practice level. Rather, my judgment should be tempered to a level of what one could reasonably expect. And I would respectfully suggest that the current policy has measured those in the grip of HMRC over the loan charge against the gold standard of tax experts, and not, as it should have been, against the standard of what one would reasonably expect a layperson to understand. Whilst I firmly believe individuals should pay their tax that they owe, ruinous action from HMRC will help no one. The government must act now to completely remove all retrospective action.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And firstly, can I congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Halton Price and Howden, in securing this debate, and all members that are members of the APPG in being here today. Only having been in this chamber for only 4 months, I'm not as experienced in others in complicated tax arrangements. But very quickly, during the election, my election campaign, and during my surgeries, this issue has proven to be a huge worry for the many of my hard-working and honest constituents who run small businesses. But for me, this is not a debate, thankfully, that revolves around complicated tax issues. It's a debate that revolves around fairness and proportionality. And that's something that I think the government has got drastically wrong, and where I think the Morse review has not gone far enough. And if I can, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll briefly outline why. Now, like my honourable friend, the member from Basildon, I believe that everyone in our country must pay the taxes that they owe. Individuals, businesses, everybody. That's how a responsible society works. But the people that this affects are not tax avoiders. Therefore, I do have some concerns on behalf of my constituents about some aspects of the government's approach to this issue, and I believe it's my duty as a constituency MP to bring these up with ministers on the front bench. Many constituents have come to see me at a surgery and have told me of the severe pressure that this has put them under. The pressure of payment, possible insolvency, has caused, in some cases, the breakdown of marriages, physical exhaustion, suicidal thoughts, through no fault of their own whatsoever. I am also aware from my constituents that many of those who use some form of disguised remuneration scheme did so at the behest of financial professionals they had hired to advise them. Some were told that these schemes were HMRC compliant. Others were not even told that these schemes were tax avoidance and that they were normal procedure. And I briefly just want, Madam Deputy Speaker, to ask the Minister to consider the following points. Of course, any shortening of the time that the people affected by this are liable for these payments is welcome. But even after 10 years, the payments over 3 years is too regimented and draconian. What thoughts has the Minister had to lengthen its terms? It is simply not fair of the HMRC to impose the retrospectivity that follows from this review. As I've said, many people were advised by financial advisors and are now being penalised because of the late realisation and intransigence of the HMRC. Will the Minister on the front bench now accept that this shouldn't be a portent to any future decision-making when it comes to policy in this area? And what steps is the Minister taking to share the cost burden with financial advisors who recommended these schemes in the first place? It seems to me that they are being let away scot-free. And lastly, I want to raise the subject of the HMRC. Now, the HMRC at normal times is not the most transparent nor easiest of government departments to deal with. HMRC are not known for their empathy or human nature. It is vital that if the government continues down this path, and I really hope that they do not, that a bespoke and compassionate team should be set up to uniquely deal with the vulnerable people in our constituencies who are affected by this measure.
On that point.
Please, yes, sir.
I think that is a gross understatement of the lack of compassion that HMRC has. But I do want to say that if there is going to be a move forward in this area, that actually HMRC can give the certainty to individuals who have suffered under this situation of the loan charge, that there will be finality in the situation.
My honourable friend is absolutely correct, and I think what I agree with him entirely, and his point backs mine up, that actually any team that's set up by the Treasury to deal with people affected by this, and there should be one, look after these people as if they are people and not just numbers, which the HMRC unfortunately has a track record of doing. But there is... Of course I will.
I think he's really put his finger on one of the core points, which is who is running the show here? Is the HMRC running the show, or is the government making sure that the law on this matter is paramount? And does he not find it ironic that in this year, in the annual report for the HMRC, they say that they want a system that can be trusted and seen to be fair, with the right safeguards in place to protect customers? And doesn't this case just show that they're falling woefully short of that ambition?
I thank my honourable friend. I agree with him entirely, and this is not the only case in HMRC dealings that I think people are being treated unfairly, and I really hope that the Minister listens to the concern around the House, particularly about this issue today, but my honourable friend is completely correct. But to add to that, there is a wider point here about the HMRC, and that is that through, as my right honourable friend has said, through their own negligence, have decided to retrospectively charge these people for payments. Never again, and I do say this very strongly, never again should they be allowed to retrospectively adopt policies to cover their failures to get their policies in order. Lastly, the Minister needs to make clear that the people affected by this are victims, and that they are people who are struggling after following advice that was given to them by independent tax experts. I hope he will do that today. So I hope the Minister will look at lengthening the repayment period, a commitment to fairness in dealing with the people that are affected by this, and never allow this to happen again. But ideally, the Minister should get to the dispatch box this afternoon and ideally scrap the loan charges that are affecting so many of my constituents.
Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I first of all pay tribute to the members and right honourable members on both benches for their eloquence and detail in presenting their argument. It will prevent me from, save me some time in my speech. Thank you. It will allow me also to give a perspective from one of my constituents. I've received a number of constituent inquiries regarding this. I will highlight one. In 2008, a constituent was a pilot with Ryanair. He was employed by them. In a change in his conditions, he was no longer an employee. He was forced to become self-employed. He attempted to register as being self-employed, and he was asked a series of questions by HMRC, including, do I supply my own equipment? Obviously not. Ryanair supplied the plane. Can I work for who I want? Absolutely not. He was rotated to work for Ryanair. Can he nominate a substitute? He cannot, because he has registered with Ryanair and he's only allowed to work so many hours. So he therefore could not honestly answer these questions and become self-employed. A number of his colleagues did, but he was an honest man and he decided not to. So he then looked for alternatives, and he found a company in the Isle of Man, a group of accountants, qualified and recognised accountants, who presented him with a legal solution for payment as known as an employee benefit trust. He didn't really understand the implication of this, but he did due diligence and found that it was indeed legal and acceptable to HMRC. He proceeded with that system for 4 or 5 years and filled in his tax returns legally every year on time and declaring his usage of that particular scheme. In 2019, he was made aware of the loan charge. He came forward straight away to HMRC and offered settlement. He assumed they would treat him as an employed person and charge him for the tax that he was due to pay. So he waited for the settlement figures, and in the meantime paid £30,000 in accelerated payment notices, and in fact advanced payment of tax. That year he received a bill of £213,000, almost half of which is made up of interest and penalties. There was no allowance for the vast expenses he incurred. Ryanair made him pay for taxis, hotels and even water. No pension relief. They did not deduct the APNs he previously paid, and he had given all this information. He is still in dispute with HMRC. None of this is fair. This, for him and his family, has been a life-changing experience. He has been treated like a criminal. He has not evaded tax law. He believes he has acted legally at all times, and he refuses to allow HMRC to ruin his life due to their incompetence. Yep. He believes it's nothing more than bullying of individuals and all-powerful and out-of-control government body who should rather be pursuing the people behind these schemes. Therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, to keep my speech short, as I appreciate you are very short of time today, I would say in the interest of natural justice and fairness, I would support this motion that the loan charge is an unjust and retrospective tax, and note that the loan charge was not settled until 2017, and call on HMRC to seize action on loans paid before 2017. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In 2018, when a group of constituents first came complaining about their treatment by HMRC to one of my surgeries, they were talking about loan schemes, of course. I wasn't particularly sympathetic. After all, why should a group of people use schemes to pay less tax than the rest of us? If they didn't pay their fair share, then others had to make it up. Or so I thought. But I was actually too harsh. Not that people shouldn't pay their fair share of tax, but more because I didn't understand the circumstances until they explained their predicament. First, the people I met clearly were not out to defraud the system. They didn't look or sound like petty criminals. They were normal, decent and honest. Some explained they didn't even have a choice, as we've heard. They either used a loan scheme, or they were not employed by the companies, or indeed the state, in some cases. Second, as self-employed individuals, they were often contracted to different entities, and nobody but themselves, from what they earned, put aside anything for pensions, sick leave, paid holidays, or indeed guaranteed employment. They were much less secure than someone with a permanent job. In the interests of being quick, I will make 4 requests to the Minister. 1, I would like to see the retrospective nature of the charge removed up until July 2017, when the Loan Charge Bill became law. That makes sense to everyone. Second, I think if that is not possible, I believe the government should revisit the settlement terms, which are hugely punitive. We've just heard from the last speaker how punitive they were. I would like to see a radical reduction in the extortionate interest rate charges and inheritance tax demands. Thirdly, all of us would find distasteful for the government to send out settlement terms using words that imply that people have deliberately broken the law. They did not. HMRC allowed the use of loan schemes. Every year they allowed, and they sent the tax return back, and people thought they were doing right. Finally, I see no reason why loan charge repayments should not be delayed by a year, rather like IR35, in response to the current health crisis we're all facing. Look, so many people are worried enough at the moment. Give them a break. Give them another 12 months. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Bambos Charalambos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me start by saying from the outset that I'm no fan of tax avoidance, and the law on disguised remuneration schemes should have been, and now has been quite rightly tightened. But the aggressive retrospective action taken by the government in pursuing the loan charge policy and the profound effects this has had on many people's lives is quite simply unjust and unfair. A significant number of people affected by the loan charge policy, including some of my constituents, are freelancers, contractors, locums and agency workers. And when the policy was introduced by the government, when IR35 was introduced by the government of the day in 1999, some of those who were employed by limited company or personal service companies sought and took professional tax advice and were advised to use umbrella company loan schemes instead, as these schemes were, and I quote, tax law and HMRC compliant. Accordingly, acting in good faith and following the advice to the letter, many entered into these loan schemes. In some cases, particularly in the public sector, some people were not even aware that they were being paid through loans. When the loan charge was introduced in 2017, seeking to recover a 20-year retrospective tax to all remuneration paid in the form of a loan, those affected were rightly angered and aggrieved, particularly as HMRC lumped all the loans together into one and insisted on the tax being paid in a single year. The shock and stress at such a draconian and unjust measure caused intense pressure on many of those affected and their families. There have been 7 known suicides from people who are facing financial ruin as a result of the demands for backdated tax from HMRC, even though it's questionable whether the tax was even owed. Relationships have broken down and it has affected people's mental health too. And it's also worth noting that HMRC have pursued individuals acting in good faith rather than those who enabled the disguised remuneration loan schemes. Thankful for small mercies, the fact that HMRC are now only pursuing schemes going back 10 years instead of 20 years is to be welcome, but many individuals are still caught by the current situation. And it seems that unlike in other areas of law, statutory time limits are of no consequence. When the Prime Minister was running to be leader of his party, he promised to review the loan charge situation, and this review was led by Sir Angus Morse. The report was published in December 2019, and whilst I welcome the recommendations of the Morse report, many of which the Government have accepted, unfortunately it does not go far enough. The report also has one fatal flaw in that it concludes that the law was clear from 2010. There are a number of ambiguities which were around at the time, such as the situation related to those who were self-employed. And why, if the law was so clear at the time, did HMRC not enforce the law then, but instead chose to introduce the loan charge in 2017? As a member of the Loan Charge APPG, I call on the governments to do a number of things. I asked them to amend the date that loan charge should apply from, instead of for 2010 to apply from when the Finance Bill got its royal assent in 2017, to ensure that closed tax years remain closed and that those with income of under 30,000 should have any outstanding balances written off after 10 years, and that legislation should cover business owners and directors as well as individual contractors. The Government and HMRC's reputation has been damaged by the way it's mishandled the loan charge situation. One principle that must underpin our legal and tax system is that things should be just and fair. And unfortunately, the loan charge and its aggressive application has been neither just nor fair. I'll give way.
Talking about that just and fairness is that as British people, we uphold, we have a rule of law which we uphold it. It's part of our very nature and fabric of Britain. And so talking about fairness and retrospective legislation in itself is against the rule of law.
The Honourable Member makes an excellent point, and it's very pertinent that we are here discussing tax going back 20 years, which it quite clearly is unfair and unjust, and retrospective legislation should be applied in this situation. I want to finish by reiterating that we must also consider that beyond the financial aspect of tax recovery, we're dealing with real people who need to be treated with fairness and respect. We have a moral duty to ensure that no more homes are lost, no more bankruptcies filed, no more lives are lost, no more families broken because of the loan charge policy.
David Simmons.
Madam Deputy Speaker, like many of those who've spoken in this debate, I met many constituents during the election campaign and since who've been directly affected by it. I've had the opportunity to go through with them many of the contracts that they signed and indeed some of the advice that they received from many of the professionals who, I think we would all agree based on what's been said today, are the villains of the peace from the perspective of this House. I heard many examples where professionals who were paid, who people should have been able to rely upon providing good, clear and legal advice, have left those people in a very difficult financial position today. But I sympathise with the position that Sir Amias Morse found himself in. And I have to say I believe that what he has put forward in his report, although there are a number of points of concern that remain, does represent a reasonable attempt at a compromise to bring about a resolution of this situation. And it is my understanding that many of these legal cases revolve around the question of how you define a loan. The position of the Inland Revenue, as it was, and HMRC now, the money that you receive for doing your work and that you spend as your income is your income and should be taxed as such. And it's always been the case that the Inland Revenue and now HMRC permit both employees and directors to receive loans from the organisations that they are working for. In fact, many of our constituents will have access to things like season ticket loans provided on a regular basis, which are free of tax because they are loans. And from reading the contracts that many of my constituents signed and having heard in detail the advice that they received, it seems to me very, very clear that at the heart of this is a fundamental problem. The schemes themselves were lawful because it was lawful to receive a loan. But the money that the constituent received was only tax-free if it was genuinely a loan. And as 5, 10, 15, 20 years have gone by, and there is a complete absence of evidence that it was genuinely a loan, because the person has received that money as remuneration and spent it as their income, HMRC have quite naturally begun to take a lot more detailed interest in that. And this situation has left many of our constituents in a real bind. Now, I'm very mindful that when you read the proposals that come from Morse, what is proposed is a process of resolution which has a number of different avenues which the individual taxpayer affected can explore. And it does seem to me, and I hope the Minister will consider, that somewhere at the heart of this is making sure that individuals who acted in good faith, but notwithstanding that were badly and incorrectly advised by professionals, should be enabled to have the benefit of the fact that they acted in good faith when they signed their tax return, even if the information on it, prima facie, was not correct, because they were not intending to evade tax. They thought they were doing something that was within the law. And in summary, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm also very conscious that whilst we have heard a very vocal campaign on this during the course of the general election, 99% of taxpayers in this country never go near a scheme like this. And I've had quite a few of those taxpayers say to me that they find it hard to credit that anybody thought that by describing the pay they received for their work on their tax return as a loan, that meant they didn't and never had to pay an income tax on it. I will.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. Jeff, in my constituency, hard-working, played by the rules, and the rules as far as Jeff was concerned and as advised by accountants, and even indeed the HMRC, was everything was in order. He's doing a good job and paying his way. It is about fairness, as members have said across the chamber, and justice.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think that's a point which everybody in the chamber is going to agree with. But fairness and justice clearly extends to this chamber making decisions that are appropriate for everybody. I'm very mindful of what my honourable friend, the member for Beckenham, said in his contribution about ensuring that everybody pays their taxes and everybody is treated fairly. And I simply wanted to say this, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's been, understandably, a huge outpouring of sympathy towards people who did not expect to find themselves facing a very substantial tax bill because they thought they had done the right thing. And I absolutely urge ministers to be as helpful and considerate as possible in approaching the settlement of that. But it is also clear to me, someone who worked as a professional in the financial advice business, not as a tax advisor, when these schemes were being rolled out, that there are huge numbers of people who avoided them because they recognised that they were being asked to put something on their tax return which they knew was not correct. And therefore we have to strike the right balance in the way that we deal with this issue today.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak in this important debate. I will be brief and focus my remarks on 2 or 3 key areas which have been partially mentioned by some colleagues earlier. I wanted to just thank the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden for securing this debate, and also to commend the work of the APPG and the cross-party nature of the debate today, which I think is very helpful. First and foremost, I do want to put on record my fundamental support for a fair tax system. We obviously need to raise taxes to pay for vital public services, but that system quite clearly has to be fair. And I think that the points made by a number of colleagues across the House on this matter are absolutely right, and I am grateful for the emerging consensus on this issue. Secondly, I'd like to just highlight the importance of the issue of the loan charge. I do think the fact that this debate is taking place today at a time of what is a period of sustained national crisis, and indeed a crisis for the whole world, is interesting, and it does underline the importance of this very issue. I certainly was approached a number of times during the general election. Like many members here today, I've had constituents who've contacted me about this issue, and there is deep unease in the community, certainly in the constituency that I represent, Reading East, which is made up of Reading itself and the neighbouring town of Woodley. There's deep unease about this problem, and many, many people are affected by it. And I noted the figure of 50,000 people across the country. It certainly seems to be higher than that in terms of the proportion of people in my community who seem to be affected by this. And I wanted to draw members' attention to both the effects on a typical town of its type, as Reading is, and specific industries where I believe there may be a particular likelihood of this problem arising. So in the areas I represent, there are a very large number of people who are self-employed, who have micro businesses or who work as consultants in one form or another. And that's spread across a huge range of sectors, from traditional small businesses through to people with trades, people with IT skills, public servants, a vast range of people. And I particularly wanted to add to the point made by my colleague, the Honourable Member for Ealing, when she spoke about the locums in public services who are affected by this. And I do know of cases where a number of people in public services have to work as set up as a company and to work on that basis, perhaps as a supply teacher or in some other interim role in public services. And I should declare an interest in that. I've certainly operated in that way in the past as somebody who's an interim public servant, as well as in the more distant past, a full-time civil servant. So it is a well-known route of employment, type of employment. A subset of those people are affected by the loan charge, not all of them. There's also in my area and many other nearby parts of the country or areas with similar high levels of employment in IT, a particular prevalence of self-employment amongst IT professionals. If you think of the great IT businesses in this country, companies like Microsoft or Oracle or Vodafone, many of them headquartered in the Thames Valley or West London, indeed some other parts of the country as well. Many of those large businesses rely very heavily on large numbers of subcontractors who have often no choice but to set up a limited company, which then serves a much bigger, larger organisation. And in my area, many, many people who are affected by the loan charge are in the IT industry. There are whole WhatsApp groups of people within particular parts of the IT industry which are buzzing with concern about this matter. And as has been said earlier, the issue ranges back over many years, and there's a deep sense of uncertainty and pressure on these people, because on these workers and their small businesses, and indeed their families, because of this whole problem. And I should add that we also, as I said earlier, we're debating this at a time of national crisis. Just imagine how that concern overlays itself on top of the existing pressures that we've talked about earlier today and yesterday. Quite rightly, in this House, we've discussed and raised the matter with the government, the importance of supporting small businesses at this time of national crisis. Imagine how it feels to be a small business person or an IT subcontractor where you are the breadwinner in your family. Your source of income could dry up because of this crisis, which is not of your making, which you have not anticipated. And at the same time, you face the long-standing problem of the loan charge looming over you, with the very grave measures which other colleagues have mentioned today, and some of them truly are dreadful, the examples that have been mentioned. And imagine that pressure, and that's, I think, what we need to do today, to think about what this feels like to somebody who is a small business person or who is self-employed. And I would just urge the Minister, I know he's a very dutiful and well-read Minister who, as was said earlier, has written a biography of Adam Smith. I do hope that he will look again at the evidence very, very clearly and very thoroughly, and look at this in the context of the current situation affecting small businesses. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to thank the Backbench Business Committee for allowing the debate when I know they had a backlog of requests from many important issues. Also, my fellow sponsors of this debate, my fellow